Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history, the kind that doesn't make it into textbooks, but absolutely should. Tonight, we're stepping into the rowdy, raucous, and sometimes downright dangerous world of medieval drinking culture. We're talking about what it really meant to get absolutely wasted in an era when water could kill you, ale was breakfast, and wine flowed more freely than common sense. But we're not stopping there. We'll explore the taverns where fights broke out over spilled drinks, the bizarre ingredients that went into medieval alcohol, the hangovers that could last for days, and the social rituals that made drinking both a necessity and an art form. We'll uncover the laws that tried to control public drunkenness, the religious attitudes toward intoxication, and the surprising ways alcohol shaped everything from politics to medicine. So, if you've ever wondered what it was like to stumble through cobblestone streets in a wool tunic after too many flagons of questionable brew, you're in exactly the right place. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. Let's start by understanding something fundamental about medieval life that modern people often overlook. Drinking alcohol wasn't just recreational, it was practically mandatory for survival. When we think about getting wasted in medieval times, we have to completely reframe our understanding of what drinking meant in that era. The water sources in medieval towns and cities were contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff: animal waste, human sewage, rotting organic matter, and disease-causing bacteria that medieval people couldn't see but definitely experienced the effects of. Drinking water straight from a well or river was essentially playing Russian roulette with your digestive system and possibly your life. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever lurked in water supplies, turning something as simple as quenching your thirst into a potentially fatal activity. So what did medieval people do? They drank alcohol, and lots of it, because the fermentation process killed many of the harmful microorganisms that made water dangerous. Ale, beer, wine, and mead became the default beverages for people of all ages, including children, though the alcohol content was generally lower than what we drink today. A typical medieval ale might have an alcohol content of around 2 to 3%, making it more like a liquid bread than the craft IPAs we sip today. People drank it with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Workers received ale as part of their wages. Monasteries brewed vast quantities for their monks. Essentially, from the moment you woke up to the moment you passed out, alcohol was flowing through your veins at levels that would concern modern doctors, but were completely normal for medieval folks. The brewing process itself was fascinating and quite different from today's sterile, regulated production. Most ale in medieval times was brewed at home, primarily by women known as brewsters or alewives. These women turned brewing into a cottage industry, producing ale in their kitchens using techniques passed down through generations. The basic recipe was simple: malted barley, water, and whatever flavoring agents they had on hand. Hops, which we associate with beer today, weren't widely used in England until the 15th century. Before that, brewsters used a mixture of herbs and spices called grute to flavor and preserve their ale. Groot could contain anything from bog myrtle and yarrow to wild rosemary and juniper berries, creating flavors that would seem bizarre and probably unpleasant to modern palates. The fermentation happened in open containers, meaning all sorts of wild yeasts and bacteria got into the brew, making each batch a unique and unpredictable experience. Sometimes you got a decent drink, other times you got something that tasted like swamp water mixed with old socks. The quality varied wildly from household to household and batch to batch. There were no quality controls, no health inspections, no standardized recipes. If someone's ale tasted particularly awful or made people sick, word would spread through the community and that brewster would lose customers, but there was no regulatory body shutting down bad operations. The ale also had a very short shelf life, usually going sour within a few days, which meant people had to drink it quickly and brewsters had to produce new batches constantly. This constant production and consumption created a culture where fresh ale was always available, and drinking was woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that are hard for us to fully grasp today. The actual process of malting the barley deserves more attention because it was labor-intensive and required specific knowledge. Brewsters would take barley grains and soak them in water for several days, allowing them to begin germinating. Brewsters would take barley grains and soak them in water for several days, allowing them to begin germinating. This process activated enzymes within the grain that would later convert starches into fermentable sugars. The timing had to be just right. Too little soaking and the enzymes wouldn't activate properly. Too much and the grain would begin growing shoots that consumed the sugars you wanted for fermentation. After soaking, the grain was spread out on floors or in shallow containers to continue germinating for several more days. The brewster had to turn the grain regularly to ensure even germination and prevent mold growth. The germinating grain generated heat, and controlling temperature was crucial. Too hot, and the grain could spoil. Too cold, and germination would slow or stop. Once germination reached the right stage, the grain had to be dried to halt the process. This was done in kilns or over fires, and the temperature and duration of drying affected the final flavor of the ale. Higher temperatures created darker, more roasted flavors, while gentler drying preserved lighter characteristics. The dried malt was then stored until brewing day, when it would be crushed to expose the starchy interior. The crushing had to break the grain without pulverizing it into flour, requiring the right tools and technique. All of this happened before the actual brewing even began, representing hours of work and careful attention. A brewer might have multiple batches of grain at different stages of malting at any given time, creating a continuous cycle of production. The investment of time and labor was substantial, but necessary to keep the household and community supplied with drinkable liquid. Now, let's talk about the places where medieval people did their serious drinking: the taverns, alehouses, and inns that dotted every town and village. These establishments were the social hubs of medieval communities, serving functions that went far beyond just dispensing alcohol. An alehouse was typically just someone's home where they sold ale from their front room. You'd walk in, sit on a bench, and drink whatever the household had brewed that week. These places were informal, cramped, and often quite rough. Taverns were a step up, offering not just ale but also wine and sometimes food. They attracted a more diverse crowd, from local craftsmen to traveling merchants. Inns were the top tier, providing accommodation along with food and drink, catering to travelers who needed a place to sleep off their hangovers before continuing their journeys. The atmosphere in these places was loud, smoky, and often chaotic. Imagine a room lit by dim candles and a fire, filled with people speaking in regional dialects you might barely understand, with the smell of unwashed bodies, spilled ale, wood smoke, and whatever was cooking in the kitchen all mixing together. The floors would be covered in rushes that soaked up spills, but also trapped dirt, food scraps, and other less pleasant things. Furniture was basic and rough, long wooden benches and tables scarred by years of use. Entertainment came in the form of dice games, card games, storytelling, singing, and occasionally musicians or performers passing through. Arguments were common, sometimes escalating into fights that spilled out into the streets. The ale flowed freely, loosening tongues and tempers in equal measure. Despite the roughness, these places were also where communities came together, where news was shared, where business deals were struck, and where people from different social classes occasionally mingled in ways that wouldn't happen elsewhere in the rigidly stratified medieval society. The physical layout of these drinking establishments reveals much about medieval life and priorities. Alehouses were often just a single room in a dwelling, with the family's living space barely separated from the area where customers drank. A brewster might serve ale from her kitchen while her children played nearby, and her husband worked at his trade in an adjacent space. Privacy was minimal, and the line between domestic life and commercial activity was blurred. The brewing equipment itself took up significant space: large kettles, fermentation vessels, storage containers, and supplies of grain and fuel. In a typical medieval house with limited square footage, dedicating space to brewing represented a real commitment. The serving area might have 1 or 2 tables with benches, accommodating perhaps a dozen people at most when crowded. Lighting came from the central hearth and perhaps a few tallow candles or rushlights, creating a dim, smoky environment. Ventilation was poor, with small windows that might be shuttered against cold or rain. The result was an atmosphere thick with smoke, body heat, and the smell of humanity. Taverns, being dedicated commercial establishments, had more space and better facilities. They might have multiple rooms, allowing for some separation between different types of customers or activities. A tavern might have a main drinking room, a separate area for dining, and possibly private spaces that could be rented for meetings or assignations. The kitchen would be more substantial, capable of producing meals beyond simple bread and cheese. Storage for wine barrels and ale casks required significant space, often in cellars where the cool temperature helped preserve the beverages. Inns needed even more room, with sleeping quarters upstairs or in attached buildings. The beds were often shared, with multiple strangers sleeping in the same bed being perfectly normal. Private rooms were luxuries reserved for wealthy travelers. The stable area for horses and other animals was essential, as most travelers arrived on horseback or with pack animals. The stable hands who cared for these animals formed part of the inn's staff, along with cooks, servers, and cleaners. Running an inn was a substantial business operation requiring capital, staff, and management skills. The owners of successful inns could become quite prosperous, forming part of the merchant class in their communities. The social dynamics within drinking establishments created complex hierarchies and unwritten rules. Regular customers had their preferred spots and would be offended if a newcomer took their usual seat. There were tables where the more prosperous craftsmen sat, areas where younger men congregated, and corners where the rougher elements gathered. Strangers had to navigate these invisible boundaries carefully to avoid giving offense. When you entered an alehouse or tavern, you'd typically greet the room generally, and regulars would assess whether you were welcome or viewed with suspicion. Your clothing, accent, and bearing all communicated information about your status and intentions. A well-dressed merchant would be treated differently from a rough laborer, and a foreign traveler might face suspicion or curiosity depending on the circumstances. The person serving the ale, whether the brewster herself or a hired server, had to manage these dynamics while ensuring everyone paid for their drinks. Credit was often extended to known customers, with accounts settled periodically, but strangers were expected to pay immediately. This created opportunities for disputes when customers claimed they'd already paid or argued about prices. The alehouse keeper or tavern owner had to be part diplomat, part enforcer, maintaining order without driving away customers. Some establishments employed strong men who could physically remove troublemakers, but in small alehouses, the brewster had to handle problems herself or call for help from neighbors. Women running alehouses faced particular challenges, as drunk men might not respect their authority or might make unwelcome advances. A brewster, with a husband or adult sons to back her up, had an easier time maintaining control than a widow operating alone. The constant need to manage drunk and potentially aggressive customers while running a business made keeping an alehouse a demanding and sometimes dangerous occupation. Yet thousands of women did it throughout medieval Europe, driven by economic necessity and the lack of other income opportunities available to them. The actual experience of getting drunk in medieval times had some unique characteristics that separated it from modern drinking. First, because people were consuming alcohol all day at low levels, there was a baseline level of mild intoxication that was just normal. It's like everyone was operating at what we might consider a light buzz constantly. This probably affected everything from decision-making to productivity, though medieval people wouldn't have noticed since everyone was in the same boat. When people wanted to get truly wasted, they had to drink a lot more of the lower alcohol ale or switch to wine, which had a higher alcohol content and was more expensive, making it a drink for special occasions or wealthier folks. Mead, made from fermented honey, was another option for those seeking serious inebriation with alcohol levels that could rival modern wines. The physical experience of getting drunk would have felt somewhat different too, because the ale was unfiltered and full of sediment, making it quite thick and filling. You'd be consuming a lot of liquid and getting full from the actual substance of the drink, not just the alcohol. This meant that getting thoroughly wasted was as much a test of stomach capacity as alcohol tolerance. Medieval people would describe various stages of drunkenness with colorful language. You might start out merry, become jolly, then progress to drunk, and finally reach completely soused or blind drunk. The hangovers were reportedly spectacular, and without modern pain relievers, people had to rely on folk remedies that ranged from the somewhat sensible, like drinking water and resting, to the absolutely bizarre, like wearing a garland of bitter herbs or consuming raw eggs mixed with various questionable ingredients. The progression of intoxication followed patterns that medieval people recognized and described in their literature and everyday language. The first stage, often called being merry or cheerful, involved the pleasant loosening of inhibitions and increase in sociability that comes with the first few drinks. People became more talkative, jokes seemed funnier, and social interactions flowed more easily. This was considered the ideal state for socializing and was actively sought in social situations. As consumption continued, the next stage brought increased loudness, decreased coordination, and impaired judgment. This was when people might start arguments, make questionable decisions, or engage in behavior they'd regret later. Medieval observers noted that people in this stage often thought they were more capable than they actually were, leading to overly ambitious plans or challenges. Further drinking led to obvious drunkenness, with slurred speech, stumbling gait, and serious impairment of physical and mental faculties. At this point, the drunk person became a potential problem for themselves and others, likely to fall, start fights, or make a fool of themselves. The final stage was complete incapacitation, where the person could no longer stand or communicate coherently and might pass out entirely. Medieval people who reached this stage were in real danger, as they might choke on vomit, suffer injuries from falls, or freeze if they passed out outdoors in cold weather. Yet reaching this state wasn't particularly unusual or scandalous, especially during festivals and celebrations. The expectations were simply that your companions would look after you to some degree, preventing the worst outcomes while mocking you for your excess. The next day would bring the inevitable reckoning, as the drunk person suffered through the physical consequences and any social embarrassment their behavior had caused. In tight-knit medieval communities where everyone knew everyone else, drunken behavior would be remembered and discussed, affecting one's reputation. Repeated episodes of extreme drunkenness could damage social standing, particularly for people whose positions required respect and authority. Yet, occasional overindulgence was accepted as part of normal life, something that happened to most people at some point and wasn't worth excessive judgment as long as it didn't become a constant pattern. The social rules around drinking were complex and varied by class, occasion, and location. Among the nobility, drinking was governed by elaborate rituals and etiquette. Feasts and banquets featured multiple courses with different wines, and knowing which drink to pair with which food was a sign of sophistication. Toasts were formal affairs, with specific protocols about who drank first and how you acknowledged your drinking companions. Getting drunk at a noble feast was almost expected, but there were still limits. You were supposed to maintain some level of decorum even while intoxicated. Passing out at the table was embarrassing, and vomiting in front of your host could damage your reputation and social standing. Among the working classes, drinking was more casual, but still had its own unwritten rules. Buying rounds for your companions was expected, and refusing to drink with someone could be seen as an insult. Alehouses had their regular customers who occupied certain spots, and newcomers had to navigate the established social hierarchies. Women generally drank less in public than men, though they certainly drank at home and in private settings. The church had complicated attitudes toward drinking. Moderate consumption was acceptable, and wine was essential for communion, but drunkenness was condemned as a sin. Priests regularly preached against excessive drinking, though many clergymen were known to enjoy their wine and ale as much as anyone. Some monasteries produced the finest alcoholic beverages of the medieval period, creating an interesting contradiction where the same institutions condemning drunkenness were also perfecting the craft of alcohol production. The etiquette of drinking among the nobility extended to the vessels used, the order of service, and even the postures adopted while drinking. At formal feasts, wine would be served by cupbearers, often young men from good families who were learning courtly behavior by serving at table. The cupbearer had to know exactly how much to pour, when to refill cups, and which guests took precedence. Spilling wine or serving in the wrong order could be a serious breach of protocol. Guests were expected to drink when toasts were offered, with refusing being a grave insult to the person offering the toast. The toasts themselves followed conventions, with the highest-ranking person present offering the first toast, followed by others in order of precedence. The content of toasts mattered too, praising the host, honoring the king or other authorities, wishing health and prosperity to those present. A clever or eloquent toast could enhance one's reputation, while a clumsy or inappropriate one could embarrass the speaker. The physical act of drinking had its own rules. You didn't gulp your wine like a peasant drinking ale, but rather sipped it appreciatively, perhaps commenting on its quality and flavor. Wiping your mouth before drinking from a shared cup was expected, as was not draining the cup entirely if it was meant to be passed to another drinker. These elaborate rules served multiple purposes. They demonstrated refinement and education, reinforced social hierarchies, and turned drinking from a simple physical act into a performance of status. For nobles, getting drunk while still observing these niceties was an art form, demonstrating that even in an impaired state, they maintained the self-control and awareness that separated them from the common people. Of course, as the night progressed and more wine was consumed, these standards often slipped. But maintaining the pretense of propriety as long as possible was itself part of the game. Foreign visitors had to learn these conventions quickly to avoid embarrassing themselves, and differences in drinking etiquette between cultures could create awkward moments or misunderstandings during diplomatic encounters. Let's dig into what was actually in these medieval drinks, because the ingredients would shock modern drinkers. We've already mentioned that hops weren't common until later in the medieval period, but what's really interesting is what brewers used instead. The Groot mixture varied regionally and was often a closely guarded secret, but it typically included plants that are either completely forgotten today or would be considered dangerous. Bog myrtle, for instance, was popular but contains compounds that can cause headaches and hallucinations in large quantities. Sweet gale was another common ingredient with mildly psychoactive properties. Some historians suggest that medieval ale might have been mildly hallucinogenic, adding an extra dimension to getting wasted that we don't experience with modern beer. Then there were additives that were just plain weird or concerning. Some brewers used bread, eggs, or even ground-up fish to clarify their ale or adjust its properties. Quality control was non-existent. So if someone wanted to stretch their ale by adding water or cheap fillers, they could, though they risked their reputation if caught. Wine production had its own issues. Medieval wine was often harsh and acidic, not the smooth vintages we enjoy today. To make it more palatable, people added honey, spices, or herbs, creating mulled wines and spiced drinks that were especially popular in winter. Some of these additives were purely for flavor, but others were believed to have medicinal properties. Medieval people believed in the humoral theory of medicine, which held that health depended on balancing 4 bodily humors, and different wines and additives were thought to affect these humors in specific ways. So drinking wasn't just about getting wasted, it was also about maintaining health, or at least that's what people told themselves as they downed another cup. The variety of flavoring agents used in medieval brewing was truly remarkable and reflected both regional availability and cultural preferences. In areas where juniper grew abundantly, juniper berries might dominate the Groot mixture, giving ale a piney, resinous flavor that modern drinkers would find quite strange. Regions with access to imported spices might include more exotic ingredients like cinnamon, ginger, or even pepper in special brews intended for wealthy customers. The balance of bitter, sweet, and aromatic elements in Groot was a matter of skill and experience, with successful brewsters developing reputations for their particular flavor profiles. Some Groot mixtures included herbs believed to have preservative qualities, extending the drinkable life of the ale by a day or two, crucial when your product had such a short shelf life. Other ingredients were included for their supposed medicinal benefits or even their effects on mood and virility. Yarrow was believed to have healing properties. Sage was thought to improve memory and wisdom, and certain herbs were considered aphrodisiacs. Whether these ingredients actually had the claimed effects is debatable, but the belief that they did influenced brewing practices and consumer preferences. Regional pride attached to local brewing traditions, with people from different areas arguing about whose ale was superior based on the local Groot recipe. This created a kind of brand identity centuries before modern marketing existed. Travelers moving between regions would notice and comment on differences in ale flavor, and local residents would defend their traditional recipes against criticism. The arrival of hops, which provided better preservation and a distinctive bitter flavor, was initially resisted in some areas as a foreign innovation that threatened traditional practices. Gradually, hop-based beer gained acceptance, but the transition took generations and met significant cultural resistance. In England, beer made with hops was initially distinguished from traditional ale without hops, with the two coexisting for a long period before beer eventually won out. This process of change illustrates how deeply embedded brewing practices were in medieval culture, not just practical activities, but expressions of regional identity and tradition. The adulterants and substitutions that less scrupulous brewers used created ongoing problems for authorities trying to maintain standards. Adding water to ale to stretch supplies was the most common cheat, but it was easily detected by taste and could be verified by ale tasters. More sophisticated adulteration involved using cheaper grains mixed with or substituted for barley. Wheat, oats, or even peas might be used, creating inferior brews that didn't taste right or ferment properly. Some brewers tried to mask poor quality ingredients with excessive amounts of strong-flavored herbs, creating harsh-tasting ales that gave drinkers fierce headaches. There are records of brewers being accused of using spoiled grain that should have been discarded, creating ale that made people ill. In extreme cases, truly toxic substances might end up in ale through ignorance or malice, plants misidentified as safe herbs, or contamination from lead vessels, or deliberate poisoning in cases of revenge or murder. The lack of scientific understanding meant that cause and effect relationships between ingredients and health problems weren't always clear. If people got sick after drinking from a particular batch, suspicion might fall on the brewer, but proving what went wrong was difficult. This uncertainty created an atmosphere of anxiety around ale quality, with people relying on reputation and personal relationships to ensure they got safe products. Brewers who consistently produced good ale could build loyal customer bases that sustained their businesses across years or even generations, with recipes and techniques passed down within families. The best brewers were valuable members of their communities, and their deaths or retirements could be significant losses. Conversely, brewers who gained bad reputations found it nearly impossible to rebuild trust, often having to move to new communities where their past wasn't known, or give up brewing entirely. The medical community of medieval times had extensive theories about alcohol and its effects on the body, most of which were completely wrong but fascinatingly detailed. Physicians believed that wine, in particular, had powerful medicinal properties when consumed in the right amounts. It was prescribed for everything from melancholy to digestive issues to plague prevention. During outbreaks of disease, doctors recommended drinking wine because they thought it strengthened the body against illness. They weren't entirely wrong, since alcohol does have antiseptic properties, but they vastly overestimated its protective effects. There were elaborate categorizations of different types of wine and their supposed health benefits. Red wine was heating and good for cold dispositions. White wine was cooling and suitable for hot temperaments. Sweet wines were nourishing, and so on. Physicians wrote extensive treatises on the proper amounts to drink, the best times of day for consumption, and which wines to avoid. Getting drunk, however, was generally seen as unhealthy by medical authorities. They believed that excessive drinking disrupted the body's humoral balance, leading to all sorts of ailments. Some physicians described hangovers in impressively accurate detail, noting the headaches, nausea, and general misery, though their explanations for why these symptoms occurred were based on humoral theory rather than actual physiology. Treatment recommendations for hangovers were varied and creative. Some doctors suggested more drinking, following the logic that whatever caused the problem could also cure it, an early version of hair of the dog. Others recommended specific foods, herbal remedies, bloodletting, or simply rest and abstinence until the body recovered. There was also awareness that chronic heavy drinking caused long-term health problems, though the mechanisms weren't understood. Medieval doctors noted that people who drank excessively developed swollen bellies, damaged livers, and deteriorating mental faculties, even if they couldn't explain exactly why this happened. The medical texts that survive from the medieval period reveal sophisticated observations about alcohol's effects, even when the explanations were incorrect. Physicians noted that wine could help digestion when consumed with meals, an observation that had some validity as alcohol stimulates gastric secretions. They recognized that moderate drinking could improve mood and relieve anxiety, what we might call alcohol's psychoactive benefits. The concept of wine as a warming substance that countered cold and dampness made sense in the context of humoral theory and reflected the actual physiological effects of alcohol causing blood vessel dilation and a feeling of warmth. Doctors prescribed specific wine-based remedies for different conditions, with recipes that combined wine with herbs, minerals, or animal products. For respiratory ailments, wine mixed with honey and herbs might be given as a syrup. For wounds, wine was used as a wash or mixed into poultices. For internal pain, spiced wine drinks were prescribed. Some of these remedies probably provided genuine relief, while others were placebos or actively harmful. The impressive aspect is the systematic approach medieval physicians took, documenting their observations and treatments, building a body of knowledge that was passed down and refined over generations. The limitation was the lack of experimental method and scientific understanding that would have allowed them to distinguish effective treatments from useless ones. Nevertheless, within their framework, medieval physicians were working seriously to understand and treat illness, and alcohol was a major part of their therapeutic arsenal. The doctor's own consumption of wine was often considerable, justified as necessary for maintaining health. Physician characters in medieval literature are sometimes depicted as particularly fond of drink, a stereotype that probably had some basis in reality. The combination of medical knowledge about wine's supposed benefits, ready access to good quality wine, and the social status that allowed indulgence without censure meant that doctors could be heavy drinkers while maintaining that they were simply following medical principles. The economics of alcohol in medieval society were substantial and affected everything from tax policy to international trade. Ale production was one of the few areas where women could earn independent income, and successful brewsters could become relatively prosperous. However, local authorities regulated the ale trade quite strictly, setting maximum prices, requiring licenses, and imposing fines for violations. Every town had ale tasters, officials who inspected the quality and pricing of ale sold within their jurisdiction. These were often unpaid positions that citizens were required to fill as part of their civic duties, though the job came with the obvious perk of free ale sampling. Ale tasters would visit alehouses and test the brew, checking if it was properly made and fairly priced. Sellers who violated the regulations faced fines or other punishments, though enforcement was inconsistent. Wine was a major import for countries like England that couldn't grow grapes effectively. French wine, particularly from Bordeaux and other regions, flowed into English ports in enormous quantities, creating a significant trade relationship. Wealthy nobles stockpiled wine in their cellars, and serving fine imported wine at feasts was a status symbol. The wine trade generated substantial tax revenue for governments, and disruptions to the supply, such as during wars between England and France, created serious economic and social problems. Taxation on alcohol was a reliable income source for rulers, though it was unpopular and sometimes sparked resistance. The church also profited from alcohol production, with monasteries operating some of the most sophisticated breweries and vineyards. Monastic communities perfected their techniques over generations, creating products that were renowned for quality. The Benedictines, Cistercians, and other orders became famous for their brewing and winemaking, and some of their traditional recipes and methods continue to influence alcohol production today. The taxation systems for alcohol were complex and varied across different regions and time periods. In some areas, taxes were levied on production, with brewers paying a fee for each batch they made or sold. This required monitoring of brewing activities, which was difficult, given that much production happened in private homes. In other places, taxes were collected at point of sale, with ale sellers required to pay a portion of their revenue to authorities. Wine imports were typically taxed at ports, providing governments with convenient collection points and predictable revenue. The rates of taxation had to be balanced carefully. Too high, and people would evade taxes through smuggling or illegal production. Too low, and the government missed revenue opportunities. Periodic attempts to raise alcohol taxes provoked resistance and sometimes riots, as people viewed access to affordable drink as a fundamental right. The revenue from alcohol taxation was significant enough that governments depended on it for military expenses, public works, and administrative costs. Wars could be partially funded through alcohol taxes, creating an ironic situation where drinking financed the military campaigns that disrupted trade and created hardship. The merchants who imported wine or traded in bulk quantities of ale could become wealthy, forming part of the merchant class that wielded increasing economic and political power in the later medieval period. Merchant guilds organized and regulated trade, setting standards for quality and business practices. These guilds had political influence, negotiating with governments over taxation rates, trade policies, and regulations. The intersection of economic interest, political power, and cultural practice around alcohol created complex dynamics that shaped medieval society in profound ways. Understanding medieval economics requires understanding the alcohol trade, as it was one of the largest sectors of the medieval economy, employing thousands of people and generating substantial wealth for producers, merchants, governments, and the church. Legal regulations around drunkenness and disorderly behavior created a fascinating glimpse into medieval attitudes toward drinking. While drinking itself was accepted and even encouraged, the consequences of getting too wasted were not. Medieval law codes and town ordinances contain numerous provisions dealing with drunk and disorderly conduct. Public drunkenness that led to fighting, property damage, or disturbing the peace could result in fines, time in the stocks, or other punishments. The stocks were a popular punishment method, where offenders would be locked in a wooden frame in a public place, forced to endure the mockery and sometimes the rotten vegetables thrown by passers-by. This public shaming was intended to discourage repeat offenses and serve as a warning to others. Tavern keepers could also face punishment if their establishments became too rowdy or stayed open past curfew. Many towns imposed curfews on drinking establishments, requiring them to close at a certain hour, often marked by the ringing of a bell. This was partly about maintaining order, and partly about fire safety, since late-night drinking in places lit by open flames was a recipe for disaster. Laws also addressed specific alcohol-related crimes, such as selling watered-down ale, charging excessive prices, or operating without a license. In some places, repeat offenders could be banned from brewing or selling alcohol, effectively destroying their livelihood. There were even laws about where and when certain people could drink. Servants, apprentices, and other workers sometimes faced restrictions on alehouse visits, especially during working hours. Sumptuary laws, which regulated consumption based on social class, sometimes extended to alcohol, limiting who could drink wine versus ale, or restricting particularly expensive imported wines to the upper classes. Enforcement was spotty and inconsistent, depending on local authorities' priorities and resources, but the existence of these regulations shows that medieval society recognized the social disruption that excessive drinking could cause, even while accepting alcohol consumption as a normal part of life. The court records that document enforcement of these laws provide fascinating glimpses into medieval life and the problems that arose from drinking. A typical session of manorial court or town court would include multiple cases related to alcohol. Brewsters fined for selling overpriced ale, individuals punished for drunk and disorderly behavior, tavern keepers cited for violations of regulations. The fines imposed were often small enough to be more annoying than seriously punitive, suggesting that authorities viewed these as minor infractions, requiring correction but not severe punishment. Repeat offenders faced escalating penalties, showing that authorities did try to modify behavior of those who consistently violated norms. The language of the court records reveals community standards and expectations. A person might be described as having been drunk and disturbed the peace, or as having sold ale at excessive price contrary to the assize, or as having kept a disorderly house where fighting occurred. These formulaic descriptions created official records of violations while also documenting the everyday reality of medieval drinking culture. The fact that the same names appear repeatedly in some court rolls suggests that certain individuals were chronic problems, regularly getting drunk and causing trouble, or consistently violating ale regulations. Others appear once or occasionally, suggesting isolated incidents rather than patterns of behavior. The community knew who the problem drinkers were, and their reputations would have been damaged by repeated court appearances, even when the official punishments were minor. For women, especially, being brought before court for alcohol-related offenses could be shameful, as it suggested loss of control and improper behavior. The intersection of legal regulation, social control, and economic activity around alcohol created a complex system that medieval people navigated daily, with most people managing to enjoy drink without running afoul of authorities, but with enough violations occurring to keep the courts busy with alcohol-related cases. Religious festivals and holy days were paradoxically the times when getting wasted was most common and most problematic. The medieval Christian calendar was full of feast days, saints' days, and other religious observances that provided breaks from work and opportunities for celebration. These celebrations typically involved special foods and, crucially, abundant alcohol. People saved up for these occasions, and alehouses and taverns did brisk business. The period of Carnival before Lent was particularly notorious for excessive drinking and rowdy behavior, as people indulged before the austere fasting period. Christmas was another major drinking season, with celebrations extending over 12 days of feasting and merrymaking. The gap between the Church's teachings about moderation and the reality of religious festivals created a kind of cognitive dissonance. Priests condemned drunkenness from the pulpit. Then the congregation went out and got thoroughly wasted to celebrate the Saints' Day. The Church tried various strategies to control this behavior, from scheduling more masses on feast days to keep people occupied, to issuing stern warnings about the spiritual dangers of overindulgence. Some religious reformers pushed for stricter observance and less celebration, but these efforts were generally unpopular and not very successful. The common people felt they had earned their feast days and weren't about to give up their drinking traditions. In fact, resistance to religious restrictions on drinking and celebration was one source of tension between church authorities and laypeople throughout the medieval period. The common people felt they had earned their feast days and weren't about to give up their drinking traditions. The Church also had to deal with drinking within its own ranks. Monasteries maintained wine cellars and breweries, and monks had daily wine rations. Some monastic rules included provisions about appropriate drinking levels and punishments for excessive consumption, indicating that drunken monks were enough of a problem to require formal regulation. There are records of monastic visitations where inspectors found monasteries where discipline had broken down and excessive drinking was rampant, though these cases were probably exceptional rather than typical. The clergy outside monasteries, particularly rural parish priests, sometimes had reputations for enjoying ale and wine a bit too much, becoming subjects of popular jokes and complaints. The specific feast days that punctuated the medieval calendar each had their own drinking traditions and expectations. Christmas celebrations began on December 25th and continued through Twelfth Night on January 6th, a period of sustained feasting and drinking that tested even the hardiest constitutions. Special brews might be prepared for Christmas, with spices and extra honey, making them richer and more potent than everyday ale. The Yule log burned in the hearth while people drank and celebrated, and the tradition of wassailing, going from house to house, singing and drinking, created communal bonds while also ensuring that large quantities of alcohol were consumed. Easter, following the privations of Lent, was another major celebration with abundant drinking. The 40 days of Lenten fasting, which restricted meat and certain other foods but generally allowed alcohol, meant that Easter Sunday brought a sense of release and celebration. May Day festivities involved outdoor celebrations, dancing around maypoles, and drinking to welcome spring. Harvest festivals in autumn celebrated the successful gathering of crops with Thanksgiving and heavy drinking. Each village would have its own local saint's day, honoring the patron saint of the parish church with special observances that included drinking. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals all involved drinking rituals, marking life transitions with communal consumption of alcohol. The sheer number of occasions requiring drinking meant that there were frequent opportunities throughout the year for people to get seriously wasted. For many people, these feast days provided the only breaks from grinding labor and difficult living conditions, making the drinking and celebration particularly important for mental health and community cohesion. The Church's ambivalence about these celebrations reflected genuine tensions between spiritual ideals and human needs, between the desire for order and discipline and the recognition that people required release and joy. The morning after getting wasted in medieval times would have been a miserable experience by any standard. Without modern pain medication, hangover sufferers had to rely on remedies that ranged from the sensible to the completely absurd. Water, rest, and light food would have helped, just as they do today, but medieval people attributed their suffering to imbalanced humors rather than dehydration and alcohol metabolism, leading to some interesting treatment approaches. Some hangover cures were based on the principle of fighting fire with fire, recommending more alcohol to ease the symptoms. Others involved consuming particular foods believed to counteract the effects of drink: bread soaked in wine, raw eggs, various broths and soups. Herbal remedies were popular, with preparations made from plants like wormwood, fennel, or mint, either consumed as teas or applied externally. Some remedies focused on purging the body of whatever was causing the distress, using emetics to induce vomiting or laxatives to clear the digestive system, which probably just made the sufferer feel worse. There were also more superstitious cures, like wearing certain plants, saying particular prayers, or performing small rituals. The reality was that medieval people just had to suffer through their hangovers without much effective relief. For someone who had gotten truly wasted the night before, the next day would involve a pounding headache, nausea, sensitivity to light and sound, and general fatigue, all while still having to perform whatever work or duties they had. Workers who showed up hungover might face disapproval or punishment from their masters or employers, though given how common drinking was, there must have been considerable tolerance for the occasional morning after misery. The timing and duration of hangovers would have been roughly similar to what we experience today, since the basic physiology hasn't changed. What was different was the context. You might be nursing your hangover while doing hard physical labor, or while attending to animals, or while trying to focus on careful craft work, all without the option of calling in sick or the benefit of effective pain relief. The wealthy and noble classes had it somewhat easier, as they could spend the day recovering in relative comfort, perhaps having servants bring them food and drink while they stayed in bed. But for the common people, getting wasted came with the price of a rough next day at work, a price they apparently found worth paying given how consistently they paid it. The folklore and traditional knowledge around hangover cures reveals much about medieval understanding of the body and illness. The belief that wearing certain plants would draw out toxins or rebalance humors led to people adorning themselves with garlands or tucking herbs into their clothing. Rosemary was particularly favored, as it was associated with memory and clear thinking, qualities obviously impaired by heavy drinking. Some people swore by walking in fresh air and allowing the morning dew to refresh them, while others insisted that staying warm and still was the better approach. The consumption of particular foods was believed to absorb or neutralize whatever was causing the hangover. Bread was thought to soak up excess moisture, while fatty foods were believed to coat the stomach and protect it. The idea that oysters, eggs, or meat would restore strength and vigor led to the consumption of these when available, though poor people couldn't afford such remedies and had to make do with whatever they had. Regional variations in hangover cures reflected local ingredients and traditions. In areas where certain herbs grew abundantly, those plants would feature prominently in local remedies. Coastal areas might have seafood-based cures, while inland agricultural regions would recommend grain-based solutions. The transmission of this knowledge happened through oral tradition, with people sharing what had worked for them and receiving advice from family and community members. Some brewsters and alewives gained reputations as experts in hangover relief, able to recommend specific brews or preparations that would ease suffering. Whether these actually worked or simply provided placebo benefits is questionable, but the psychological comfort of having a remedy to try probably helped people feel more in control of their misery. The fact that hangovers were common enough to generate an entire body of folk remedies shows how thoroughly normalized heavy drinking was in medieval culture. Getting wasted and suffering the consequences was such a regular occurrence that people developed elaborate systems for dealing with it, passing down knowledge through generations. Different regions and cultures within medieval Europe had their own distinctive drinking traditions and preferences. In Germany and Central Europe, beer was king, and the brewing traditions there developed earlier and more sophisticatedly than in other areas. German towns became famous for their breweries, and the beer purity laws that eventually developed there set standards that influenced beer production across Europe. In France and Southern Europe, wine was the dominant alcoholic beverage, with elaborate classifications of different wine regions and types. The French took winemaking seriously as both an economic activity and a cultural practice, developing techniques and knowledge that made French wine the most prized in medieval Europe. Italy also had strong wine traditions, and Italian merchants controlled much of the wine trade throughout the Mediterranean. In Scandinavia and northern regions, mead made from fermented honey was more common, particularly in areas where grain agriculture was difficult but beekeeping was viable. The Vikings and their descendants had a reputation for heavy drinking, with mead halls being central to their social and political culture. Drinking competitions and boasts made while drunk were taken seriously in Norse culture, and there are sagas that feature drinking as a major plot element. Eastern Europe had its own traditions, with kvass, a fermented beverage made from rye bread, being popular in Slavic regions. The Islamic world, which controlled significant portions of medieval territory, officially prohibited alcohol consumption based on religious law, though enforcement and adherence varied. In regions where Christian and Islamic cultures met, particularly in Spain and the Eastern Mediterranean, there were interesting cultural exchanges and tensions around drinking practices. Jewish communities within Christian Europe maintained their own traditions around wine, particularly its ritual use, and Jewish merchants were sometimes involved in the wine trade. These regional variations meant that a traveler moving across medieval Europe would encounter dramatically different drinking cultures, with each region proud of its own traditions and often dismissive of others' preferences. The specific brewing traditions of different regions reflected not just available ingredients, but also climate, water quality, and cultural preferences shaped by centuries of practice. German brewing, for instance, benefited from excellent water sources and abundant barley, allowing brewers to focus on perfecting their techniques. The cooler climate of Central and Northern Europe also favored beer production, as fermentation worked better in moderate temperatures, and the finished product kept longer in cool storage. The eventual development of lager-style brewing, which used bottom-fermenting yeast and cold storage, emerged from these conditions and German brewing expertise. French winemaking traditions varied dramatically by region, with Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, and other areas developing distinctive styles based on local grape varieties, soil conditions, and techniques. The French understanding that terroir, the specific combination of soil, climate, and location, affected wine quality, was sophisticated and created a system where wines from particular vineyards or regions commanded premium prices. Italian winemaking was equally diverse, with different regions producing different styles ranging from light, acidic wines suitable for daily consumption to rich, complex wines for special occasions. The Italian connection to ancient Roman winemaking traditions meant that some techniques had been practiced continuously for over 1,000 years, refined through generations of experience. Spanish wine production was influenced by both Christian and Islamic cultures, with the latter's nominal prohibition on alcohol leading to some interesting historical ironies, as wine production continued in Islamic-controlled areas for trade and for non-Muslim populations. The fortified wines that Spain later became famous for had medieval precursors, developed to make wine stable for long sea voyages. In Eastern Europe, the colder climate and different agricultural conditions led to different brewing traditions, with hardier grains and different fermentation techniques. The Slavic tradition of kvass represented an adaptation to local ingredients and tastes, creating a beverage that was refreshing, mildly alcoholic, and nutritious. These regional differences weren't just technical variations. They were sources of cultural identity and pride, with people strongly identifying with their local drinking traditions. The connection between alcohol and violence in medieval society was recognized and frequently discussed. Tavern brawls were common enough to be a standard feature of medieval life, commemorated in countless court records and contemporary complaints. The combination of alcohol, close quarters, armed men, and the hot-tempered culture of honor that prevailed in medieval society created a volatile mix. Insults that might be ignored when sober became fighting words after a few drinks. Disputes over games, women, debts, or simply perceived disrespect escalated quickly. The fact that many men routinely carried knives or even swords meant that these fights could turn deadly. There are numerous records of coroners' inquests investigating deaths that occurred during drunken fights in alehouses. Sometimes these were ruled accidents. Other times the killer was prosecuted for murder or manslaughter, depending on the circumstances. Weapons weren't always involved. Plenty of people were beaten to death with fists, clubs, or improvised weapons. The authorities struggled to control this violence. Some towns tried banning weapons in alehouses with limited success. Others increased penalties for fighting while drunk or required tavern keepers to intervene in disputes. The reality was that alcohol-fueled violence was accepted as an inevitable part of life, something to be managed rather than eliminated. Women faced particular dangers in drinking establishments, as drunk men could become aggressive or predatory. There are court records of assaults and harassments occurring in and around taverns, though these were probably underreported given the difficulty women faced in seeking justice. Some towns tried to regulate female presence in alehouses, either requiring women to be accompanied by male relatives or limiting the times when they could be present. These regulations were as much about protecting women from drunken violence as they were about controlling female behavior and maintaining social order. The link between alcohol and domestic violence was also recognized, though medieval society's patriarchal structure meant there was little recourse for women suffering abuse from drunken husbands. The specific mechanisms by which alcohol contributed to violence were understood intuitively by medieval people even without modern neuroscience. They recognized that drink loosened inhibitions, making people more likely to act on angry impulses they might normally suppress. They observed that alcohol impaired judgment, causing people to misinterpret situations or overestimate their own capabilities in fights. The phenomenon of liquid courage, where drunk people felt braver and more willing to confront others, was well known and often mocked in stories and jokes. Medieval observers also noted that some people became mean or aggressive when drunk, their personalities changing in unpleasant ways, while others became jovial or sleepy. This recognition that people reacted differently to alcohol was sophisticated, though they attributed it to individual temperament and humoral balance rather than genetics and brain chemistry. The culture of honor that prevailed among men, particularly in the nobility and knightly classes, meant that insults and challenges had to be answered to preserve reputation. Alcohol intensified this dynamic, making men more sensitive to slights and more aggressive in defending their honor. Duels and challenges that might have been avoided when sober became inevitable when drink was involved. The Church condemned this violence, preaching about the sin of wrath and the importance of turning the other cheek, but these teachings had limited effect on deeply ingrained cultural patterns. The secular authorities tried various approaches to controlling alcohol-related violence, from curfews and weapon restrictions to harsh punishments for offenders, but none proved entirely effective. The violence continued throughout the medieval period and beyond, a dark side of drinking culture that everyone recognized but no one could eliminate. Alcohol's role in politics and diplomacy during medieval times was substantial and often overlooked. Important negotiations and treaties were conducted over wine and feasts, with drinking together serving as a bonding ritual and a sign of trust. Refusing to drink with someone could be interpreted as an insult or a sign of mistrust, potentially derailing negotiations. Conversely, getting your negotiating partner drunk was a recognized tactic, hoping they'd agree to terms they might otherwise reject or reveal information they intended to keep secret. Royal courts featured elaborate drinking ceremonies with specific wines served in specific circumstances and toasts offered according to careful protocols. The ability to hold one's liquor was seen as a political skill, demonstrating self-control and strength. Conversely, drinking too much and making a fool of yourself could damage your political standing and reputation. There are accounts of medieval rulers and nobles whose excessive drinking became political liabilities, causing them to make poor decisions or lose the respect of their subordinates. In some cases, rivals would deliberately encourage a ruler's drinking as a way to weaken their authority or influence their decisions. Diplomatic gifts often included fine wines or other alcoholic beverages, with the quality and quantity of the gift reflecting the importance of the relationship. Wine was also used as a form of tribute or payment, with vassals sometimes owing their lords a certain quantity of wine as part of their obligations. Control over wine production and trade could be a source of political power, and conflicts sometimes arose over these issues. The relationship between England and France, for example, was influenced by the wine trade, with English control over Bordeaux providing access to French wine that both kingdoms valued. Wars and political disruptions that interrupted the wine supply created real economic and social hardships. Within towns and cities, guilds and governments regulated the alcohol trade, creating opportunities for corruption and political maneuvering. Those who controlled brewing and tavern licenses could enrich themselves and their allies, leading to political conflicts. In some cases, disputes over ale regulations or wine imports became serious political issues that divided communities and required intervention by higher authorities. The specific examples of alcohol's role in political events bring this dynamic to life. There are accounts of treaty negotiations where the celebration afterward involved so much drinking that some participants couldn't sign the documents until the next day when they'd sobered up. Diplomatic missions often included elaborate feasts where the host's wealth and power were displayed through the quality and quantity of wine served. A visiting ambassador who was served inferior wine might interpret it as an insult to his sovereign, potentially creating diplomatic incidents. The strategic use of alcohol in negotiations could be quite calculating, serving strong wine while drinking water oneself, or encouraging opponents to drink heavily while staying relatively sober to maintain clear thinking. Some medieval rulers gained reputations as either heavy drinkers or abstemious, and these reputations affected how others interacted with them. A king known for loving wine might receive wine as gifts from those seeking favor, while one known for moderation might be approached differently. The politics of alcohol extended to domestic governance as well, with rulers having to balance revenue needs against popular resistance to alcohol taxes, and having to decide how strictly to enforce regulations against drunkenness and disorder. Some rulers took personal interest in their wine cellars, maintaining detailed records of what was stored and served, while others delegated these matters to stewards. The ability to offer guests the finest wines was a demonstration of wealth and power, and rulers competed to outdo each other in the quality of their cellars and the lavishness of their feasts. These displays served political purposes, impressing allies and intimidating rivals, reinforcing the ruler's status and resources. The intersection of drinking culture with political power reveals how thoroughly alcohol was integrated into medieval governance and statecraft. The literature and songs of medieval times are full of references to drinking, revealing cultural attitudes and providing glimpses of actual drinking practices. Drinking songs were a popular genre, celebrating the joys of ale and wine, while often mocking those who drank too little or too much. These songs were performed in taverns and at feasts, with everyone joining in the chorus. The lyrics were often playful and filled with suggestive humor, containing jokes and wordplay that might have been considered inappropriate in more formal settings, but were accepted in the lively and relaxed atmosphere of taverns and drinking halls. Epic poems and romances often featured feasting and drinking scenes, with elaborate descriptions of the wines served and the behavior of the participants. Knights and nobles in these stories displayed their prowess not just in battle, but also in their capacity for drink, with the ability to remain composed while consuming large quantities being portrayed as a virtue. Religious literature took a more critical view, with sermons and moral tales warning about the dangers of drunkenness. These texts portrayed excessive drinking as a path to sin, describing how it led to lust, violence, sloth, and other vices. The drunk was a stock character in medieval drama and literature, often portrayed as foolish and contemptible, used for comic relief, but also as a moral warning. Folk tales and legends incorporated drinking in various ways, from magic potions and enchanted wines that caused transformations or revealed truths, to contests where characters had to outdrink opponents or resist the temptation of delicious-looking drinks that were actually dangerous. Some tales featured taverns as settings where adventures began or important information was learned, reflecting their role as community gathering places. The written records we have probably underrepresent how much drinking and drunkenness featured in oral storytelling and folk culture, since these were less likely to be recorded by literate monks and scribes who had their own biases. Nevertheless, the prevalence of alcohol in medieval literature across all genres shows how central it was to the culture and imagination of the time. These specific literary works that survive give us detailed pictures of medieval drinking culture. The Carmina Burana, a collection of songs and poems from the 13th century, includes numerous drinking songs with irreverent and humorous content, celebrating wine and criticizing sobriety. These songs, many written by wandering scholars and clerics, show that even educated and religious men participated enthusiastically in drinking culture. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, depicts pilgrims who drink and tell stories, with the character of the miller being notably drunk and bawdy. The tales themselves reference drinking throughout, treating it as a normal part of life while also satirizing excessive consumption. Medieval romances about King Arthur and his knights feature numerous feasting scenes where drinking plays a prominent role, with the Round Table gathering being as much about communal drinking as about chivalric brotherhood. The Norse sagas describe drinking in mead halls as essential to social and political life, with the ability to compose poetry while drinking being a valued skill. These literary depictions, while not straightforward historical records, reflect real practices and attitudes, showing us what medieval people found entertaining, admirable, or cautionary about drinking. The persistence of drinking themes across different types of literature and different time periods within the medieval era demonstrates the enduring importance of alcohol in medieval culture. Writers returned again and again to drinking as a subject, finding it rich with possibilities for humor, drama, moral instruction, and social commentary. Let's consider the practical realities of producing enough alcohol to keep an entire society drinking all day, every day. The scale of medieval brewing and winemaking was enormous, requiring vast quantities of raw materials and significant labor. For ale production, huge amounts of barley had to be grown, harvested, malted, and stored. Malting involved soaking the grain to start germination, then drying it to stop the process, creating the enzymes needed for fermentation. This was time-consuming and required careful attention to prevent spoilage. Water sources had to be maintained, though, as we've discussed, the water didn't need to be drinking quality since the fermentation process would make it safer. Fuel was needed for boiling the wort, creating demand for wood or other combustibles. The actual brewing was labor-intensive, with heavy pots that needed tending, ingredients that had to be measured and mixed, and the final product that needed to be stored and distributed. Individual households might brew once or twice a week, producing enough for their own consumption plus some to sell. Larger operations, like monastic breweries or commercial brewhouses that developed later in the medieval period, operated on bigger scales but faced the same basic challenges. Wine production had different requirements, needing suitable land for vineyards, knowledge of grape cultivation, proper timing for harvest, and facilities for fermentation and storage. Wine could be stored much longer than ale, making it more practical for trade and transport. The wine industry employed thousands of people in growing regions, from the vineyard workers who tended the vines, to the coopers who made barrels, to the merchants who transported the final product. The logistics of getting wine from southern France to England or from Germany to Italy were complex and expensive, involving ships, wagons, and pack animals, as well as payments for tolls, taxes, and protection. Mead production required access to honey, making it dependent on beekeeping, an art form of its own in medieval society. Beekeepers maintained hives, harvested honey and wax, and sold these valuable commodities to brewers and others. The sheer economic weight of alcohol production and distribution in medieval society can hardly be overstated. It employed people, generated trade, provided tax revenue, and consumed resources on a massive scale. A society that drank alcohol all day needed an enormous infrastructure to make that possible, and medieval Europe developed that infrastructure over centuries of practice and refinement. The agricultural requirements for alcohol production shaped medieval farming practices and land use. Barley fields covered substantial portions of arable land, with farmers dedicating significant acreage to growing grain for brewing rather than baking. The choice between growing barley for ale or wheat for bread involved economic calculations about which would bring better returns. In some years, weather conditions might favor one crop over the other, affecting both food and ale supplies. Poor harvests created crises, as both bread and ale became scarce and expensive, leading to hunger and social unrest. Medieval farmers had to plan their plantings carefully, balancing subsistence needs with market opportunities. The rotation of crops to maintain soil fertility included barley in the cycle, with fields alternating between different crops and fallow periods. The harvest of brewing barley was a major agricultural event requiring mobilization of labor to cut, gather, and thresh the grain before weather could damage it. The grain then had to be stored safely, protected from moisture, rodents, and other threats that could ruin the supply. Vineyards required different agricultural practices, with vines needing years to mature before producing usable grapes. The establishment of a vineyard was a long-term investment, requiring initial capital and years of work before generating returns. Vineyard work was skilled labor, with pruning, training vines, and managing the growing cycle requiring knowledge and experience. The grape harvest was time-sensitive, with optimal ripeness lasting only days or weeks, creating intense periods of activity when entire communities mobilized to bring in the crop. The crushing and initial fermentation had to begin immediately before the grapes spoiled, creating logistical challenges in processing large quantities quickly. The seasonal rhythm of viticulture shaped life in wine-producing regions, with different activities dominating different times of year. This agricultural foundation of alcohol production meant that drinking culture was directly connected to farming, with the availability and quality of drinks depending on agricultural success. Personal hygiene and alcohol consumption intersected in ways that might surprise modern readers. The stereotype of medieval people being filthy and unwashed is somewhat exaggerated, but it's true that bathing was less frequent than today, and hygiene standards were different. Drinking all day long contributed to body odor, as alcohol metabolism produces compounds that are excreted through sweat and breath. A room full of people who'd been drinking all day would have had a distinctive smell, adding to the already pungent atmosphere of medieval interiors. Halitosis from constant ale consumption must have been nearly universal, though since everyone suffered from it, perhaps it was less noticeable. The diuretic effect of alcohol meant frequent urination, and the toilet facilities of medieval times were basic at best: chamber pots, privies, or just finding a discreet outdoor spot. Public urination was common in towns and cities, contributing to the generally unsanitary conditions. Taverns and alehouses would have outdoor privies that got heavy use during drinking sessions, and the smell around these establishments must have been quite something during warm weather. Vomiting from overindulgence was common enough that it wouldn't have been particularly remarkable. Someone stumbling outside to be sick was just part of the scenery around drinking establishments. The combination of spilled ale, vomit, urine, and other bodily fluids on tavern floors, even when covered with rushes, created conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. The lack of effective cleaning methods and the constant traffic of people and animals meant these places were genuinely filthy by our standards. Getting wasted in such an environment meant being immersed in sensory experiences that modern people would find intolerable, but medieval people were accustomed to and apparently undisturbed by these conditions. The wealthy had somewhat better circumstances, with cleaner facilities and servants to manage the messier aspects of heavy drinking. But even nobles and their guests in castles and manor houses dealt with conditions that were primitive compared to today. The specific sanitation challenges of drinking establishments created ongoing problems that owners and communities struggled to manage. The rushes covering floors had to be changed periodically, but the frequency varied widely depending on the establishment and the diligence of the owner. Some places might change rushes weekly, others monthly, or even less often, allowing filth to accumulate to nauseating levels. When rushes were finally replaced, the smell of the accumulated waste underneath was reportedly overwhelming. The outdoor privies at taverns and alehouses were basically pits or trenches that gradually filled with human waste. Eventually, These had to be cleaned out, a job so unpleasant that it was assigned to the lowest members of society. The waste might be taken away to be used as fertilizer or simply dumped somewhere outside town, spreading contamination and disease. The drinking vessels themselves were rarely washed thoroughly by modern standards. A quick rinse in water that might itself be dirty was often all they got before being used again. The sharing of cups and bowls meant that diseases could spread easily among drinkers. The serving jugs and containers were similarly compromised, with interiors that might never be properly cleaned, allowing bacterial growth and contributing to the quick spoilage of ale. The barrels and casks used for storage could become contaminated, with subsequent batches of ale picking up off flavors or actual pathogens from previous contents. The tools and equipment used in brewing faced similar challenges, with thorough cleaning being difficult or impossible given available methods. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory and couldn't see the bacteria and other microorganisms that flourished in these conditions, but they did notice when things smelled bad or when people got sick. The connection between sanitation and health was dimly understood, leading to some efforts at cleanliness, but nothing approaching modern standards of hygiene. The combination of poor sanitation and constant alcohol consumption created health risks that medieval people accepted as unavoidable parts of life, not realizing that many illnesses attributed to bad air or humoral imbalances were actually spread through contaminated drinking establishments. Seasonal variations affected drinking patterns in interesting ways. Summer was brewing season for ale, as the warmer temperatures made fermentation more reliable. However, the same warmth meant ale spoiled faster, requiring even more frequent brewing and quicker consumption. Summer also brought harvest time, with hard physical labor and hot conditions creating tremendous thirst. Workers in the fields consumed enormous quantities of weak ale to stay hydrated, and harvest festivals at season's end featured heavy drinking as a way to celebrate and relax after the grueling work. Fall brought grape harvests in wine regions, with the entire community mobilizing to pick grapes at the optimal time. The crushing and initial fermentation happened immediately after harvest, creating a brief period of frantic activity. New wine, drunk before it fully matured, was a special treat of the autumn season. Winter brought different challenges, with cold temperatures slowing fermentation but improving storage. Mulled wine and spiced drinks were popular winter beverages, warmed over fires and drunk to ward off the cold. The Christmas season, as mentioned earlier, was a major drinking period, with special brews and drinks prepared for the festivities. Winter was also when preserved foods and salted meats dominated diets, making people thirstier and leading to increased drinking. Spring was a lean time, with winter stores running low and new crops not yet ready. Ale and wine supplies might be depleted, and quality might suffer as older stocks were consumed. Lent, falling in spring, imposed religious restrictions on consumption that varied in how strictly they were observed. The prohibition on meat during Lent didn't include alcohol, so drinking continued, though the overall caloric restriction meant people might get drunk more quickly on less. The cycle of seasons created a rhythm to drinking culture, with different times of year bringing different drinks, different occasions, and different levels of consumption. This seasonal pattern was deeply embedded in medieval life, linking drinking to agricultural cycles, religious calendars, and the basic rhythms of nature. The impact of weather on drinking culture went beyond just seasonal patterns. Unusually cold winters might freeze fermentation vessels or wine cellars, disrupting production and damaging supplies. Hot summers could cause rapid spoilage, leaving communities short of drinkable liquids during the time they needed them most. Droughts affected both grain and grape harvests, creating shortages that drove up prices and reduced availability. Excessive rain could ruin crops in the field or promote mold growth in stored grain, with similar effects. These weather-related disruptions to alcohol supplies were serious problems that affected everyone from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble. A bad harvest year meant not just less food, but also less ale, wine, and mead, creating compounded hardships. Medieval people lived much closer to these agricultural realities than we do, understanding that weather directly affected their ability to drink and therefore their ability to avoid waterborne illnesses. The anxiety about supplies during bad years was real and justified, and communities had to find ways to stretch limited stocks or seek alternative sources. Trade could help, with wine or ale being brought in from areas that had better harvests, but this was expensive and not always feasible. The weather's impact on drinking culture reminds us how vulnerable medieval people were to environmental factors they couldn't control, and how central alcohol was to their daily survival rather than being merely recreational. Children's consumption of alcohol in medieval times deserves special attention because it differs so dramatically from modern practices. From a young age, children drank small ale, a weak brew with very low alcohol content. This was considered normal and necessary, given the unsafe water supplies. The alcohol content was low enough that children weren't getting obviously drunk, but they were consuming small amounts of alcohol daily from early childhood. This early exposure created a culture where drinking was completely normalized, not something you started doing as a rebellious teenager, but something you'd done your entire life. As children grew older and began working, their ale rations increased, transitioning gradually to the stronger ales that adults consumed. There's no evidence that medieval people saw any problem with this practice. Child welfare, as we understand it, didn't exist, and the dangers of alcohol to developing brains weren't known. The choice was between giving children potentially contaminated water or giving them weak ale, and ale seemed the safer option. Teenagers apprenticed to trades would have drunk alongside adult workers, participating in the drinking culture of their workshops and guilds. Young people at festivals and celebrations would have had access to stronger drinks, and getting drunk for the first time would have been a rite of passage, though not one that was formally marked or particularly remarkable. The long-term health effects of lifelong alcohol consumption starting in childhood are unknown, but they were probably real. Medieval people's overall life expectancy was lower than ours for many reasons, and chronic low-level alcohol consumption might have contributed, though it's impossible to separate this factor from all the others. What's clear is that medieval childhood included regular alcohol consumption as a normal and unremarkable part of life, creating a society where literally everyone, from toddlers to the elderly, was part of the drinking culture. The specific ways that children's drinking was managed varied by social class and family circumstances. In poor families, children drank whatever ale was available, typically the weakest and cheapest. In wealthier households, special small ale might be brewed specifically for children with even lower alcohol content. The transition from child to adult drinking happened gradually, without formal markers, as young people simply began consuming more and stronger beverages as they took on adult responsibilities. Parents didn't worry about their children drinking because everyone drank, and the concept of protecting children from alcohol didn't exist. The idea that alcohol might harm children specifically, as opposed to harming anyone who drank excessively, wasn't part of medieval thinking. Children were seen as small adults who would gradually take on adult capacities and responsibilities, and drinking was just one of many adult behaviors they learned through observation and participation. The social aspects of drinking were learned young, with children observing their parents and other adults in alehouses and at feasts, absorbing the customs and expectations of drinking culture. By the time they reached adolescence, young people were fully socialized into these practices, knowing how to conduct themselves in drinking situations and understanding the social rules governing alcohol consumption. This early and thorough socialization meant that drinking culture was deeply ingrained, passed down from generation to generation through practice and example rather than formal instruction. The role of women in drinking culture requires more detailed examination. As we've noted, women were the primary producers of ale in many households, giving them economic power and expertise in this crucial activity. Brewsters could earn significant income and achieve a measure of independence unusual for medieval women. However, the brewing profession also came with risks and suspicions. The association between brewing and women, particularly older women, contributed to stereotypes and eventually to witch persecution in the late medieval and early modern periods. The image of a woman stirring a cauldron, which we associate with witches, derives partly from the reality of brewsters stirring their brewing pots. Women who brewed ale used herbs and plants for flavoring, knowledge that could be reinterpreted as suspicious or magical when attitudes shifted. Successful brewsters who prospered from their trade might attract jealousy or resentment, making them targets for accusations. In terms of consumption, women definitely drank alcohol, both ale and wine, though social expectations about female drinking were more restrictive than those for men. Women were expected to maintain modesty and propriety, and getting visibly drunk was seen as particularly shameful for a woman in ways it wasn't for a man. A drunk woman was vulnerable to assault and harassment, and might also be blamed for whatever happened to her, with people saying she'd brought it on herself through immodest behavior. Despite these restrictions, women did drink throughout their daily lives, just as men did, consuming ale with meals and during work. Pregnant women drank ale, having no reason to think it might harm their unborn children, since the concept of fetal alcohol syndrome wouldn't be understood for many centuries. Women at celebrations and festivals would drink more freely, though still within bounds of propriety. Noble women had more freedom in some ways, as they could drink fine wines in the relative safety of their social circles, though they too faced expectations about maintaining dignity and avoiding excess. Widows who inherited brewing businesses or taverns faced particular scrutiny, as independent women managing businesses that involved serving alcohol to men challenged social norms. The Church expressed special concern about women and drinking, with sermons warning that drunken women were particularly prone to sexual sin and loss of virtue. These attitudes reflected broader patterns of medieval misogyny and the double standards applied to male and female behavior. Despite all these restrictions and dangers, women were integral to drinking culture as both producers and consumers, and their experiences of getting wasted, while less documented than men's, were undoubtedly real and frequent. The specific experiences of women in alehouses and taverns reveal the complexities of their position in medieval drinking culture. Women who operated alehouses from their homes had to balance their roles as business owners with social expectations about female behavior. They needed to be friendly and welcoming to attract customers, but not so familiar that they invited unwanted attention or damaged their reputations. The line between acceptable hospitality and improper behavior was constantly negotiated and easily crossed, with women facing criticism and judgment that male alehouse keepers didn't face. Women serving ale to male customers had to manage the advances and comments that were inevitable when men were drinking, developing strategies to deflect or diffuse situations without losing business. Some women gained reputations as skilled managers of rowdy establishments, able to maintain order through force of personality or clever handling of difficult customers. Others had male family members who provided muscle and authority when needed. Women drinking as customers in alehouses faced different challenges, with their presence sometimes welcomed and sometimes resented, depending on the establishment and the circumstances. Respectable married women might drink in alehouses, accompanied by their husbands or other family members, their respectability protected by male presence. Single women or widows drinking alone or with other women faced more scrutiny and potential harassment. The assumption that women in alehouses might be prostitutes meant that any woman present could be propositioned or treated disrespectfully. Some women embraced this association and used alehouses as places to conduct sex work, while others struggled against the stigma. The intersection of gender, alcohol, and commerce created complicated dynamics that women had to navigate carefully, with their economic opportunities and personal safety often in tension. Transportation and drinking created problems that medieval society struggled to address. People traveled by foot, horseback, or cart, and attempting these modes of transportation while drunk led to predictable accidents. Falling off horses, stumbling into ditches, getting lost, or simply passing out on the road were common occurrences. Winter travel while drunk was particularly dangerous, as people could freeze to death if they passed out outdoors in cold weather. There are coroner's reports of people who died from exposure after drinking too much and failing to make it home safely. Rivers and bodies of water posed drowning risks for the intoxicated, and many towns and cities had regulations about securing docks and bridges to prevent drunk people from falling into the water. Ferrymen and boatmen had to deal with drunk passengers who might cause disturbances or fall overboard. Carters and wagon drivers who drank while transporting goods created dangers for themselves and others on the road. Animals pulling carts could be spooked or might take advantage of an inattentive driver, leading to runaways and accidents. The roads themselves were often poor, with ruts, holes, and obstacles that were challenging enough to navigate sober and became truly hazardous when drunk. Travelers staying at inns would drink heavily in the evening, then have to continue their journeys the next day while nursing hangovers, slowing their progress and increasing the likelihood of problems. Pilgrimages, which brought together large numbers of travelers, often featured heavy drinking at stops along the route, with some pilgrims apparently more interested in the drinking opportunities than the religious aspects of the journey. The famous Canterbury Tales depicts pilgrims telling stories while traveling, and drinking features prominently in the narrative, reflecting the reality of medieval pilgrimage culture. Merchant caravans would have included drinking among their evening activities, with guards and merchants relaxing after a day of travel. Military campaigns involved massive logistical challenges in providing alcohol to troops, as soldiers expected regular ale or wine rations and would become mutinous without them. Armies on the march required supply trains carrying barrels of drink, and besieging forces needed to maintain these supplies or find local sources. Drunk soldiers were a discipline problem and a tactical liability, but completely denying them drink was impossible given cultural expectations and a need for safe beverages. The specific dangers of traveling while intoxicated were well documented in medieval records, though rarely did these incidents lead to changes in behavior. People continued to drink before and during travel despite the risks, because drinking was so thoroughly integrated into daily life that abstaining seemed impossible or pointless. The distances people traveled in medieval times were often short by our standards, with most people rarely venturing more than a few miles from their homes. For these short journeys, getting drunk and then walking or riding home was manageable for most people most of the time, with incidents being occasional rather than constant. Longer journeys required more planning and presented greater risks. Travelers on roads between towns might stop at alehouses or inns along the way, drinking at each stop and accumulating intoxication throughout the day. By the time they reached their destination or wherever they were staying for the night, they might be thoroughly drunk. The hospitality expected at inns included providing alcohol with meals and throughout the evening, so travelers were continuously drinking during their stays. The next morning, they would set out hungover, facing another day of travel and drinking. This cycle could continue for days or weeks for long journeys, taking a toll on physical health and increasing cumulative risks. Some travelers learned to moderate their drinking to remain functional, while others seemed incapable of or uninterested in restraint. The merchant who needed to conduct business at his destination had practical reasons to stay relatively sober, while the pilgrim on a religious journey might see heavy drinking as harmless recreation. The varied purposes of medieval travel created different drinking patterns, but almost all travel involved substantial alcohol consumption as an unavoidable feature. The criminal underworld and drinking establishments had close connections that authorities recognized but struggled to control. Taverns and alehouses served as meeting places for criminals, where stolen goods were fenced, illegal deals were struck, and plans were laid. The anonymity and crowds provided cover for illicit activities, and the presence of alcohol loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, making people more likely to engage in illegal behavior or reveal information they should keep secret. Prostitution often operated in or near drinking establishments, with sex workers finding customers among the drunk and lonely men who frequented these places. Town authorities tried to regulate prostitution, sometimes establishing official brothels in specific districts and trying to keep prostitutes out of taverns, though enforcement was inconsistent. Gambling, which was illegal or restricted in many jurisdictions, flourished in alehouses despite official prohibitions. Dice games and card games could involve substantial sums of money changing hands, and disputes over gambling debts led to fights and sometimes deaths. Professional gamblers and con artists worked taverns, taking advantage of drunk marks who didn't realize they were being cheated until it was too late. Thieves and pickpockets found easy pickings among intoxicated tavern-goers who weren't paying attention to their belongings. Violence and threats were tools of criminal enforcement, with debts collected and disputes settled through intimidation or worse. Some tavern keepers were complicit in criminal activities, either because they were criminals themselves or because they'd been intimidated into cooperation. Others tried to maintain order and keep their establishments respectable, but the nature of the business made this challenging. The line between legitimate business person and criminal could be blurry, as activities that we'd consider normal business practices might violate medieval regulations on pricing, quality, or trading hours. The association between taverns and crime reinforced negative attitudes toward drinking establishments among religious and civic authorities, providing justification for attempted crackdowns that never fully succeeded in cleaning up the tavern scene. The specific criminal enterprises that operated through taverns and alehouses were diverse and often sophisticated. Organized theft rings used taverns as meeting places where stolen goods could be evaluated and sold to fences who would resell them in other markets. The tavern keeper might get a cut of the proceeds for providing the venue, or might simply tolerate the activity to avoid trouble. Counterfeiters used the back rooms of taverns to conduct business, passing fake coins in the dim light where careful inspection was difficult. The drinking helped distract potential victims and made them less likely to notice irregularities. Smugglers used coastal taverns to distribute goods that had avoided customs duties, with the tavern serving as warehouse and sales point. Corruption of officials happened over drinks, with bribes offered and accepted in tavern meetings that could be disguised as social occasions. Information brokers gathered intelligence by listening to drunk people talk, then selling what they learned to interested parties. Spies for foreign powers or rival nobles frequented taverns, seeking information about troop movements, political developments, or commercial opportunities. The deserters from armies and runaway servants found refuge in rough taverns where questions weren't asked and strangers were common. The overlap between drinking culture and criminal activity was substantial enough that authorities regularly raided suspect establishments, though their success in disrupting criminal networks was limited. The mobile and fluid nature of tavern populations, with people constantly coming and going, made sustained surveillance difficult. The fact that even respectable people frequented taverns meant that distinguishing criminals from legitimate customers wasn't always easy. The criminals themselves were often skilled at blending in, appearing as ordinary drinkers while conducting their illegal business discreetly. Military culture and drinking were thoroughly intertwined, with alcohol consumption being central to the identity and morale of medieval fighting forces. Soldiers expected regular rations of ale or wine as part of their compensation, and commanders who failed to provide drink faced serious morale problems. The shared experience of drinking together built camaraderie and unit cohesion, creating bonds between soldiers who might come from different regions and backgrounds. Before battles, alcohol might be distributed to steady nerves and build courage, though the line between beneficial courage and dangerous recklessness was thin. After victories, heavy drinking was part of the celebration, with soldiers getting thoroughly wasted to mark their success and blow off the psychological pressure of combat. After defeats, drinking helped numb the pain and fear, though it could also lead to recriminations and fights among demoralized troops. The violence and trauma of medieval warfare created psychological wounds that we'd now recognize as PTSD, and alcohol was the only coping mechanism available, leading to patterns of heavy drinking among professional soldiers and veterans. Mercenaries, who formed a significant portion of many medieval armies, had particularly rough reputations for drinking and the behavior that accompanied it. Garrison duty in castles and fortified towns involved long periods of boredom interrupted by occasional danger, and drinking helped pass the time. However, drunk guards were a security risk, failing to maintain proper watches or respond effectively to threats. Military regulations often included provisions about drinking, trying to maintain discipline while recognizing that completely prohibiting it was impractical. Punishments for excessive drinking ranged from fines to flogging to execution in extreme cases, though enforcement depended on commanders' priorities and the military situation. Naval forces faced particular challenges, as ships carrying large quantities of alcohol had to prevent unauthorized consumption while ensuring the drink didn't spoil during long voyages. Sailors, like soldiers, had reputations as heavy drinkers, and port towns featured numerous establishments catering to sailors on shore leave looking to spend their pay on drink and other pleasures. The combination of accumulated wages, time away from home, and the dangers of their profession made sailors particularly enthusiastic customers for taverns and alehouses. The specific military contexts for drinking created unique problems and situations. Army camps were essentially temporary cities that needed to be supplied with food and drink for thousands or tens of thousands of men. The logistics of transporting enough ale or wine for an army on campaign were staggering, requiring hundreds of barrels and carts or ships to move them. When supply lines were disrupted, armies faced serious problems, with soldiers becoming unruly or even mutinous without their expected drink. Besieging armies sometimes found local sources of alcohol, raiding surrounding areas or commandeering supplies from nearby towns, but these sources weren't always sufficient. The besieged forces inside castles or cities faced different challenges, having to ration their supplies to last through sieges that might continue for months. Running out of drink could undermine morale and encourage surrender even when food supplies remained adequate. The cultural expectation that soldiers would be provided with drink meant that commanders had to prioritize alcohol logistics alongside food, weapons, and other necessities. After battles, the wounded would be given alcohol, both as pain relief and as an antiseptic for wounds, depleting supplies that then had to be replenished. The tendency of victorious armies to loot and pillage included seizing all available alcohol, with soldiers getting drunk on captured supplies and sometimes becoming disorganized and vulnerable to counterattack. Smart commanders tried to control the distribution of captured alcohol to prevent their forces from becoming incapacitated, but this was difficult to enforce when soldiers felt entitled to celebrate their victory. The intersection of military necessity, cultural expectation, and practical limitations around alcohol created constant challenges for medieval commanders trying to maintain effective fighting forces. The intersection of drinking and religion went beyond what we've already discussed, touching on fundamental theological questions and daily practices. Wine's central role in the Christian Eucharist meant that alcohol had sacred significance, representing the blood of Christ. This created a complex situation where wine was simultaneously a holy substance and a potential source of sin through excess. Theological debates addressed questions like whether the wine used in communion actually transformed into Christ's blood or was merely symbolic, with different Christian traditions reaching different conclusions. The requirement that priests consecrate and consume wine during Mass meant that clergy had regular access to what was often the best wine available, since churches wanted to offer quality products for sacred purposes. Some priests developed drinking problems, and church records contain references to clergy who consumed communion wine excessively or drank outside the context of religious services in ways that caused scandal. Monastic communities, as we've mentioned, were major producers of alcohol, but they also had rules governing consumption. The Rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monasteries, specified that monks should receive a daily wine ration, acknowledging that while abstinence might be ideal, it was unrealistic to impose. Different monastic orders had varying attitudes toward drinking, with some allowing more consumption than others. Reform movements within the Church periodically tried to impose stricter standards, but the fundamental acceptance of alcohol in Christian culture meant these reforms had limited success. Feast days honoring saints often involved their relics or images being paraded through towns, with celebrations that included heavy drinking. This created situations where religious devotion and drunken revelry existed side by side, sometimes uncomfortably. The Church collected tithes that included portions of wine and ale production, giving it a financial stake in the alcohol economy. Church lands often included vineyards or leased land to wine producers, providing revenue. Some bishops and abbots became quite wealthy, partly through income from alcohol production and trade. The tension between profiting from alcohol and preaching against its abuse was recognized and sometimes criticized, but never fully resolved. The specific theological arguments about alcohol reveal the complexity of medieval religious thought. Some theologians argued that God created wine and other alcoholic drinks as gifts to humanity, meant to be enjoyed in moderation. The Bible contained numerous references to wine in positive contexts, and Jesus' first miracle at Cana involved turning water into wine, which was interpreted as divine approval of alcohol. Other religious thinkers emphasized the dangers of drunkenness, citing biblical passages that condemned excessive drinking and the sins it led to. The challenge was defining where moderate, acceptable drinking ended and sinful drunkenness began. Different authorities drew this line in different places, creating a range of opinions within Christian thought. Some ascetic movements within Christianity advocated complete abstinence from alcohol as part of a broader rejection of worldly pleasures, but these remained minority positions. The mainstream church maintained that moderate drinking was acceptable, while excess was sinful, a position that reflected practical reality and scriptural interpretation. The sacramental use of wine created a special category where alcohol wasn't just acceptable, but necessary for religious practice. This elevated wine above other beverages in theological terms, giving it spiritual significance that ale or mead didn't have. The fact that only wine, not other alcoholic drinks, was used in communion reinforced its special status. Debates about the precise nature of transubstantiation, how bread and wine became Christ's body and blood, occupied medieval theologians at length, showing how seriously they took the sacramental use of alcohol. These theological discussions filtered down to ordinary believers through sermons and religious instruction, shaping attitudes toward drinking even among people who didn't understand the fine points of theological debate. The changing seasons affected not just production, but also the types of drinking activities and social gatherings. Winter nights, being long and dark meant more time spent indoors, in alehouses and around fires, with storytelling, games, and drinking stretching late into the evening. The cold weather made heated, spiced drinks particularly appealing, and recipes for warming beverages were passed down and refined. Snow and ice made travel difficult, so drinking occasions in winter tended to involve local communities rather than travelers and strangers. Spring brought a sense of renewal and celebration after the hardships of winter, with festivals marking the changing season and agricultural activities resuming. The availability of fresh ingredients meant that spring drinks could be flavored with new herbs and plants. Summer, with its longer daylight hours, meant outdoor drinking was more common, with people sitting outside alehouses or gathering in gardens and fields. The heat increased thirst, but also meant that ale spoiled more quickly, creating a race to consume it before it went bad. Harvest festivals in late summer and fall were major drinking occasions, celebrating the successful gathering of crops with Thanksgiving and heavy drinking. The grape harvest in wine regions was a particular celebration, with new wine being eagerly anticipated. Fall also brought preparations for winter, including preserving foods and laying in supplies of drink to last through the cold months when production would be more difficult. The cycle repeated year after year, with drinking patterns reflecting the agricultural calendar and the rhythms of pre-industrial life. People planned their production and consumption around these seasonal patterns, knowing from experience what they'd need and when. The predictability of the cycle gave structure to the year, with certain drinks and certain types of celebrations associated with particular seasons. Breaking these patterns, such as running out of drink during winter or having harvest failures that limited production, created serious social stress and demonstrated how dependent medieval society was on maintaining its alcohol supply. The psychological and social functions of seasonal drinking patterns went beyond simple availability of beverages. Winter drinking served to combat seasonal depression and the hardships of cold weather, with communal gatherings in warm alehouses providing both physical comfort and social support during difficult months. The long winter nights could be oppressive when spent alone in cold, dark homes, but drinking with companions in taverns offered light, warmth, conversation, and connection. Spring festivals that involved drinking marked the psychological relief of surviving another winter and the hope that came with warmer weather and renewed agricultural activity. The energy and optimism of spring was celebrated with drinks made from fresh ingredients and outdoor gatherings that would have been impossible in winter. Summer drinking often had a more casual, recreational quality, with people having more leisure time and better weather allowing for outdoor socializing. The long days meant that work and drinking could both be extended, with people laboring during daylight hours and then drinking into the evening. The harvest festivals that marked the transition to fall were psychologically important as moments of community celebration after collective labor. Everyone had worked hard to bring in the crops, and the feasting and drinking that followed were earned rewards that strengthened community bonds. The progression through the seasons created a rhythm that gave structure and meaning to medieval life, with drinking culture marking and celebrating each phase of the annual cycle. Drinking vessels and equipment reflected social status and technological capabilities in revealing ways. The poorest people might drink from shared wooden cups or bowls, passing them around a group. Clay or pottery vessels were common among working people, cheap to produce but fragile and porous. Leather containers were used for storage and sometimes for drinking, though they could impart flavors to the contents. The wealthy drank from metal vessels, pewter, silver, or even gold for the very richest. The type of vessel you drank from immediately communicated your social position. Elaborate drinking horns, particularly in Norse and Germanic cultures, were status symbols decorated with metalwork. Some vessels had special significance, passed down through families or given as diplomatic gifts. The size of drinking vessels varied enormously, from small cups for expensive wine to large tankards holding substantial quantities of ale. Communal drinking vessels, shared among a group, created social bonds but also spread disease, as everyone's lips touched the same rim. The serving and storage equipment was equally varied, from simple clay jugs to elaborate metal serving sets for nobility. Barrels and casks were crucial technology, allowing transport and storage of large quantities. Cooperage, the art of making barrels, was a skilled trade essential to the alcohol economy. Different sizes and types of barrels were used for different beverages and purposes. The tapping of a new barrel was often a small celebration in itself, marking the availability of fresh drink. Measures and standards for serving sizes were supposed to be regulated, with official sizes for various drinks, though actual practice varied. Tavern keepers might use measures that were slightly smaller than official standards to increase profits, a form of cheating that authorities tried to prevent through inspections. The equipment needed to produce alcohol, brewing kettles, fermentation vessels, strainers, and tools represented significant investments, and the quality of this equipment affected the final product. Wealthy monasteries and noble estates might have sophisticated brewing or winemaking facilities, while household production may do with simpler tools. The craftsmanship involved in making drinking vessels and alcohol production equipment was considerable, representing specialized skills passed down through apprenticeship systems. Potters who made clay drinking vessels and storage jars needed to understand clay properties, firing temperatures, and glazing techniques. The vessels had to be watertight and durable enough for regular use, requiring skill to achieve. Metal workers who crafted pewter, silver, or gold drinking vessels were highly trained artisans whose work served both functional and decorative purposes. Elaborate drinking vessels for the wealthy might feature engraved designs, jeweled decorations, or intricate metalwork that showcased the craftsman's skill and the owner's wealth. Coopers who made barrels needed to understand wood properties, moisture content, and the precise shaping required to create watertight containers without using glue or nails. The staves that formed barrel sides had to be carefully cut and fitted, with metal hoops providing compression to seal the joints. Barrels had to withstand the pressure of fermentation, the stress of transport, and repeated use, making cooperage a demanding craft. The specialized tools used in brewing and winemaking, large kettles, ladles, strainers, measuring vessels, were often custom-made by blacksmiths or other metalworkers to meet specific needs. A wealthy monastery might commission elaborate brewing equipment designed for large-scale production, while a household brewster would make do with simpler implements that still required good craftsmanship to function effectively. The economic ecosystem around alcohol production and consumption supported numerous trades and crafts, creating employment and driving technological innovation. The sounds of medieval drinking culture would have been distinctive and pervasive. All houses and taverns were noisy places, filled with conversation, laughter, arguments, and singing. The sound of liquid being poured from jugs into cups or bowls was constant. Barrels being tapped, with the hollow thump and then the rushing sound of ale flowing out, signaled fresh supplies arriving. Drinking songs, bawdy and loud, would echo from establishments into surrounding streets. The scraping of benches and stumbling of drunk people created their own soundtrack. Arguments that escalated into fights brought shouts and the sounds of bodies colliding, furniture breaking, and objects being thrown. The morning after a night of heavy drinking, towns would wake to the sounds of hungover people going about their business with less energy and more groaning than usual. Street vendors might call out offerings of food and drink to passers-by. In production settings, the bubbling and fermenting of ale created background noise in households where brewing was happening. The rhythmic pounding involved in malting grain added to the soundscape. In wine regions during harvest, the sounds of grapes being crushed, whether by feet in large vats or by other methods, would fill the air. The creaking of carts hauling barrels of wine or ale to market, the splash of liquid being transferred between containers, and the countless small sounds associated with the daily consumption of vast quantities of alcohol all contributed to the auditory environment of medieval towns and villages. These sounds were so constant and familiar that people probably didn't consciously notice them, just as we don't actively hear the sounds of cars and electronic devices that fill our modern environments. But to a time traveler from our era, the sounds of medieval drinking culture would be immediately noticeable and would continue day and night, a constant reminder of how central alcohol was to every aspect of life. The specific acoustic characteristics of different drinking environments created distinct soundscapes. A small alehouse in someone's home would have the intimate sounds of a few people talking and drinking in close quarters, with voices echoing off wooden walls and low ceilings. The fire crackling in the hearth provided constant background noise, along with whatever domestic activities were happening: children playing, animals moving about, cooking sounds from the kitchen area. A larger tavern would be louder and more chaotic, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously, creating a din that made it difficult to hear someone across the room. The servers calling out orders, the clatter of vessels being set on tables, the scraping of benches as people shifted positions, all these sounds layered together into a cacophony that was the normal atmosphere of busy drinking establishments. In noble halls during feasts, the sounds would be different. More ordered conversation among the elite, musicians performing, formal toasts being announced and responded to, the rustle of fine clothing, and the clink of quality metal drinking vessels. The contrast between the rough and ready alehouse and the refined great hall would have been stark, audible proof of social divisions. Outside these establishments, the sounds of drunk people singing, arguing, or simply making their way home would echo through medieval streets, particularly on festival nights when large numbers of people were out drinking. The night watch calling hours and patrolling for disturbances would add to the nighttime soundscape, with drunks being confronted and sometimes escorted home or taken into custody. Let's consider some specific historical examples and documented cases of medieval drunkenness to ground our understanding in actual events. Court records and chronicles provide glimpses of real incidents. In 13th century England, coroners' rolls document numerous deaths related to alcohol. One case describes a man who got drunk at an alehouse, stumbled into a ditch on his way home, and drowned in shallow water. Another tells of a fight over a gambling debt that started in a tavern and ended with one man dead from stab wounds. Chronicles of noble houses document feasts where guests drank themselves insensible, sometimes with serious consequences. There's an account of a wedding feast where so much wine was consumed that several guests died, though whether this was from alcohol poisoning or from choking on their own vomit while passed out isn't clear from the record. Monastic visitation records provide evidence of drinking problems within religious communities. One visitation found a monastery where the abbot was regularly drunk and had allowed discipline to completely break down, with monks drinking at all hours and neglecting their religious duties. Town records show the ongoing struggle to regulate alehouses and punish violators. One English town's records from the 14th century show the same woman being fined repeatedly for selling overpriced ale, continuing to violate regulations despite the penalties. Military chronicles describe armies being surprised and defeated because soldiers were too drunk to fight effectively, or garrisons falling because guards were intoxicated during attacks. Royal accounts show the enormous quantities of wine purchased for court consumption, with some medieval kings spending substantial portions of their revenue on drink for themselves and their households. Letters and personal documents occasionally mention drinking, usually disapprovingly when discussing someone else's behavior. One medieval letter writer complains about a business partner who drinks too much and makes poor decisions as a result. Medical case studies describe patients suffering from what we'd recognize as alcoholism, though medieval doctors attributed the symptoms to humoral imbalances rather than addiction. These documented cases remind us that behind the generalizations about medieval drinking culture were real individuals whose lives were shaped and sometimes ended by their relationship with alcohol. The economic class distinctions in drinking culture reveal the stratified nature of medieval society. Peasants and laborers drank mostly ale, the cheapest and most available beverage, produced locally and consumed fresh. Their drinking happened in basic alehouses or at home, and while they might get thoroughly drunk on special occasions, their daily consumption was limited by cost and the need to remain functional for work. The quality of what they drank was often poor, with thin ale that barely qualified as alcoholic. Craftspeople and merchants had access to better ale and occasional wine, representing their middle position in society. Their drinking establishments were more comfortable, and they could afford to drink more and better quality products. The meals they consumed while drinking might include better food, and they had more leisure time to spend in taverns. The nobility and wealthy merchants drank primarily wine, often imported and expensive. They could afford the finest vintages, store them properly in cellars, and serve them at elaborate meals with multiple courses. Their consumption happened in private halls or select establishments, separated from the common people. The very wealthy competed over who could serve the rarest and most expensive drinks, making alcohol a form of conspicuous consumption and status display. Kings and great nobles maintained wine cellars that contained hundreds or thousands of barrels, representing enormous wealth. The church hierarchy also participated in this class-based drinking, with bishops and abbots enjoying fine wines, while ordinary priests and monks had more modest fare. These class distinctions were reinforced through sumptuary laws and social customs that specified who could drink what. Attempts by lower-class individuals to drink above their station could provoke criticism or even legal penalties. The experience of getting wasted varied dramatically based on social class. A noble might pass out drunk in a cushioned chair in a heated hall, while a peasant might collapse on a dirt floor in a drafty alehouse or in a ditch on the way home. The consequences of drunken behavior also varied by class, with nobles facing social censure but rarely serious legal penalties, while common people might be fined, whipped, or placed in stocks for the same behavior. The visual indicators of social class in drinking situations would have been immediately apparent to medieval observers. The clothing worn by drinkers signaled their status. Nobles in fine wool or silk garments with elaborate decoration, merchants in good quality cloth with some ornamentation, craftspeople in sturdy but plain work clothes, laborers in rough, patched garments. The drinking vessels used reinforced these distinctions, with nobles drinking from silver or gold cups, merchants from pewter, and laborers from clay or wood. The settings differed dramatically, from the tapestry-hung great halls with their elaborate furniture and decorations where nobles feasted, to the bare-walled rushes-on-the-floor alehouses where laborers drank. The food served with drinks followed similar patterns, with nobles enjoying elaborate multi-course meals featuring meat, fish, spices, and imported delicacies, while laborers had bread, cheese, and perhaps some simple stew. The behavior expected and tolerated also varied by class, with nobles held to standards of courtesy and refinement that laborers weren't expected to meet, though nobles also had more freedom to behave badly without facing serious consequences. These visible markers of class difference were maintained even in situations where alcohol lowered inhibitions and might otherwise have allowed for more mixing across social boundaries. The class system was so deeply embedded in medieval culture that even drink didn't erase it, though it might temporarily soften some of the barriers. The class system was so deeply embedded in medieval culture that even drink didn't erase it, though it might temporarily soften some of the barriers. The medical understanding of addiction, or what medieval people would have called habitual drunkenness, was limited but not entirely absent. Physicians and moral writers recognized that some people drank compulsively and seemed unable to stop despite negative consequences. They attributed this to weakness of will or corruption of the humors rather than understanding addiction as we do today. Treatment recommendations were generally ineffective. Prayer, penance, herbal remedies supposed to reduce the desire for drink, or simply advice to exercise self-control. The concept of treating addiction as a disease didn't exist, so people suffering from what we'd call alcoholism were seen as moral failures rather than as needing medical help. Families might try to limit an alcoholic member's access to drink or their money to buy it, but social isolation was difficult in communities where everyone knew everyone else, and alcohol was everywhere. Some chronic drunks became community fixtures, known for their constant intoxication and used as cautionary examples in sermons and moral instruction. Others maintained functional lives despite heavy drinking, their habits tolerated because they still performed their work and met their obligations. The line between normal heavy drinking and problematic alcohol dependency was blurry, since so many people drank so much as a matter of course. Only when someone's drinking led to obvious disasters, lost employment, impoverishment, violence, or death did it become clearly problematic. Even then, the response was more likely to be moral condemnation than help. The physical health consequences of long-term heavy drinking weren't fully understood, though doctors did observe the swollen bellies, jaundice, and mental deterioration that we now associate with cirrhosis and other alcohol-related diseases. Medieval understanding was that these were separate ailments rather than connected to drinking, or that they resulted from humoral imbalances that drinking had worsened. The shortened lifespans of heavy drinkers might not have been obvious in an era when life expectancy was low for many other reasons. In retrospect, medieval society probably had many people who were, by modern standards, alcoholics, functioning within a culture that normalized constant drinking and lacked both the understanding and the resources to address addiction. The role of alcohol in medieval medicine extended beyond general health theories to specific treatments and preparations. Alcohol was used as a solvent to extract medicinal compounds from herbs and plants, creating tinctures that were administered to patients. Wine was mixed with various ingredients to create specific remedies for different ailments. Wine mixed with herbs for digestive problems, wine with honey for coughs, and so on. Some of these preparations probably had genuine medical benefits, either from the herbal compounds or from the antiseptic properties of alcohol. Others were pure superstition with no therapeutic value beyond placebo effects. Alcohol was used to clean wounds, which actually was beneficial given its antiseptic properties, though medieval doctors didn't understand why it worked. Strong spirits, which were being developed through distillation late in the medieval period, were seen as particularly powerful medicines. Aqua vitae, or water of life, was distilled alcohol believed to have almost miraculous healing properties. Early distillation produced relatively small quantities of high-proof alcohol that was expensive and rare, used medicinally rather than for recreation. As distillation techniques improved, stronger alcoholic drinks became more available, though they remained more common in the late medieval and early modern periods than in the High Middle Ages. The medical use of alcohol created another justification for drinking. People could claim they were consuming it for health reasons, not just pleasure. Of course, the line between medicinal use and recreational drinking was easily crossed. Someone might start by taking wine-based medicine for an ailment and continue drinking for the pleasant effects. Physicians themselves often drank significantly, both for their own health and for pleasure, sometimes developing reputations as drunkards. The overlap between medical practice, alcohol consumption, and the broader drinking culture was substantial, with each reinforcing the others in a society where alcohol was seen as both necessary for health and dangerous in excess. As we approach the end of our journey through medieval drinking culture, it's worth reflecting on what all this tells us about medieval society and human nature more broadly. The medieval relationship with alcohol was shaped by practical necessity, cultural tradition, religious belief, and social structure. People drank because they had to. Water wasn't safe. They drank because they enjoyed it. Alcohol provided pleasure, relaxation, and escape from difficult lives. They drank because it was social. Sharing drinks created bonds and marked important occasions. They drank because it was expected. Refusing drink was suspicious or insulting. Getting wasted in medieval times meant participating in a culture where alcohol was woven into every aspect of existence, from morning to night, from birth to death, from sacred rituals to profane celebrations. The experience of drunkenness itself, the loosening of inhibitions, the loss of coordination, the altered consciousness, was the same then as now, but the context was completely different. Medieval people got drunk in a world without modern medicine, without police forces, without safety nets, where the consequences of impaired judgment could be immediately fatal. They did it anyway, consistently and enthusiastically because the benefits seemed to outweigh the risks. The brewing and drinking of alcohol represented significant technological achievement, economic activity, and cultural sophistication. Medieval people weren't primitive or simple. They created complex systems of production and distribution, developed elaborate social rituals, and thought deeply about the meanings and implications of drinking. The fact that some aspects of their drinking culture seem strange or troubling to us, the constant consumption by children, the acceptance of public drunkenness, the association with violence, reminds us that cultural values change over time. Things that seemed normal and necessary to them strike us as problematic or dangerous. Future generations will doubtless look at our own drinking culture and find aspects of it equally strange. Understanding medieval drinking isn't just an academic exercise or entertainment. It's a window into how people lived, what they valued, and how they made sense of their world. It shows us human beings coping with difficult circumstances, seeking pleasure and community, creating meaning through shared rituals, and sometimes making terrible decisions with tragic consequences. In other words, people being people, just in a very different time and place. The legacy of medieval drinking culture extends into our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. Many of our drinking traditions, from toasting to buying rounds, have medieval origins. The beers we drink today descend from medieval ales, though they're much more refined and consistent. Wine culture still carries elements of medieval appreciation for quality and variety. Pubs and bars serve similar social functions to medieval taverns, as places where communities gather and bonds are formed. The regulatory frameworks we use to control alcohol sales and consumption evolved from medieval attempts to manage the same issues. Even our ambivalence about alcohol, recognizing both its pleasures and its dangers, echoes medieval attitudes. We've gained tremendous understanding about how alcohol affects the body, how addiction works, and what responsible consumption looks like. But we haven't solved all the problems medieval people faced. Drunk driving replaces falling off horses, but the fundamental issue of impaired decision-making remains. Alcohol-fueled violence still plagues our society. People still use drinking to cope with stress, celebrate occasions, and bond with others. The specifics have changed, but the human relationship with alcohol shows remarkable continuity. Looking back at medieval drinking reminds us that current practices aren't inevitable or natural. They're products of specific historical circumstances. Water safety, which we take for granted, fundamentally changed the necessity of alcohol consumption. Modern medicine provides alternatives to alcohol-based remedies. Better understanding of addiction allows us to help people in ways medieval society couldn't. Yet alcohol remains central to many cultures, including our own, suggesting that its appeal goes beyond mere necessity to something deeper in human nature, the desire for altered consciousness, for social bonding, for pleasure and escape. The technological innovations in alcohol production that developed during the medieval period laid foundations for modern brewing and winemaking. The gradual refinement of techniques through centuries of trial and error created knowledge that was passed down and built upon. The introduction of hops revolutionized brewing, allowing beer to keep longer and travel farther, enabling the development of commercial brewing on larger scales. The improvement of barrel-making technology made long-distance wine trade more feasible, allowing wines from specific regions to develop international reputations. The development of distillation, though it emerged late in the medieval period, opened up entirely new categories of alcoholic beverages that would become important in subsequent centuries. These technological advances weren't the result of scientific research in the modern sense, but rather the accumulated practical knowledge of generations of brewers, vintners, and merchants who experimented, observed results, and shared their findings. The monastic communities that maintained continuity of brewing and winemaking practice over centuries played crucial roles in preserving and advancing this knowledge. The craft guild systems that trained new generations of brewers and coopers ensured that skills were passed down and standards maintained. This medieval foundation made possible the further developments of the early modern and modern periods, creating the sophisticated alcohol industry we have today. When we drink a beer or glass of wine now, we're benefiting from techniques and knowledge that have roots stretching back through the medieval period and beyond. The social and cultural patterns around drinking that developed in medieval times have shown remarkable persistence. The idea of the local pub or bar as a community gathering place where people know each other and regular customers have their preferred spots echoes the medieval alehouse. The practice of marking major life events, weddings, christenings, funerals, with drinking gatherings continues traditions that were firmly established in the medieval period. The association of holidays and celebrations with special drinks and heavy consumption follows patterns set centuries ago. Even the gender dynamics around drinking, while much changed, still bear traces of medieval attitudes, with women who drink heavily facing different social judgments than men who do the same. The concern about alcohol and young people, though manifested differently now than in medieval times when children drank weak ale daily, reflects ongoing anxieties about alcohol's effects on the young. The debates about how to regulate alcohol, balance individual freedom against social order, and manage the economic benefits of the alcohol trade against its social costs all have medieval precedents. The tension between alcohol as source of pleasure and community on one hand, and as cause of violence, disorder, and health problems on the other, is the same tension medieval people wrestled with. Our solutions may be different and hopefully more effective, but the fundamental challenge remains. This continuity suggests that the human relationship with alcohol touches on something fundamental about our nature, our desire for altered consciousness, our need for social rituals, our tendency to seek pleasure even when it involves risks. The diversity of medieval drinking cultures across different regions and social classes reminds us that there was no single medieval experience. A peasant drinking weak ale in an English village, a noble sipping wine in a French chateau, a monk brewing in a German monastery, a merchant trading wine in an Italian port city. All of these were part of medieval drinking culture, but their experiences were vastly different. The generalizations we make about medieval drinking have to be understood as describing patterns and tendencies, not universal experiences. Regional variations in climate, agriculture, trade connections, and cultural traditions created different drinking cultures within the broader medieval world. Social class created equally significant variations, with the drinking experiences of rich and poor having little in common beyond the basic fact of consuming alcohol. Understanding this diversity helps us avoid oversimplified views of the medieval period as a homogeneous time. It also highlights how factors like geography, economics, and social structure shape cultural practices. The same forces that created diversity in medieval drinking culture continue to create diversity in modern drinking practices across different regions and social groups. Recognizing this helps us understand both history and our contemporary world. The stories of individual medieval people, glimpsed through court records, chronicles, and other documents, bring the general patterns to life. The Brewster, fined repeatedly for selling overpriced ale, was trying to make a living in difficult circumstances, stretching her ale with water to increase profits, even though she knew it was against regulations and risked punishment. The monk who drank too much and neglected his duties was perhaps struggling with the gap between the ascetic ideals of monastic life and his own human weaknesses and desires. The soldier who got drunk and got into a fight was dealing with the trauma of combat and the violent culture of military life in the only way available to him. The noble who drank himself to death was perhaps trying to escape political pressures, family problems, or simply boredom. The peasant who drowned in a ditch while drunk was just trying to make it home after some drinks with friends, his death a tragic accident that ended a life we know nothing else about. These individual stories, fragmentary as they are, remind us that history is made up of real people making real choices in specific circumstances. The patterns and generalizations help us understand the bigger picture, but the individual stories remind us of the human reality behind the statistics. Each person who lived through the medieval period had their own relationship with drinking, shaped by their personality, circumstances, and choices. Some probably drank moderately and rarely got drunk. Others were heavy drinkers who spent much of their lives intoxicated. Most were probably somewhere in between, drinking regularly because everyone did, occasionally getting wasted on special occasions, and dealing with the consequences as best they could. The moral and ethical questions raised by medieval drinking culture are worth considering. Was it wrong for medieval people to give weak ale to children when the alternative was potentially contaminated water? From our perspective, with our knowledge of fetal alcohol syndrome and alcohol's effects on developing brains, it seems concerning. But from their perspective, with their understanding and options, it seemed like the responsible choice. This gap between what seemed right to them and what seems right to us reminds us that moral judgments must account for context and available knowledge. It's easy to criticize past practices from our position of greater understanding, but the relevant question is whether people made reasonable choices given what they knew and what options they had. Similarly, the acceptance of public drunkenness and alcohol-fueled violence seems problematic to us, but medieval people lacked the tools and knowledge to effectively address these issues. They tried various approaches, laws, punishments, moral instruction, but nothing worked very well. We have better tools now, but we still struggle with alcohol-related problems, suggesting that these are genuinely difficult issues without easy solutions. The medieval experience can teach us humility about our own ability to solve social problems, even as we recognize that we have advantages they lacked. The complexity of medieval drinking culture, simultaneously necessary and problematic, source of community and cause of disorder, medical treatment and health threat, reflects the complex nature of alcohol itself, which hasn't changed even though our understanding of it has. The environmental and resource implications of medieval alcohol production were substantial. The huge quantities of grain needed for brewing competed with grain for bread and other foods, creating tensions during years of poor harvests. The fuel needed for brewing consumed wood resources at a time when forests were already under pressure from other uses. The land devoted to vineyards could have been used for other crops, representing an opportunity cost. The transport of wine and ale required animal power and infrastructure, consuming resources that could have been used for other purposes. Medieval people made these trade-offs because alcohol was essential to their survival and their culture, but the costs were real. The environmental impact of alcohol production in the medieval period was probably modest compared to modern industrial production, but in the context of medieval society, with its limited resources and lower productivity, it was significant. Understanding these resource implications helps us appreciate how committed medieval society was to maintaining its alcohol supply. They were willing to dedicate substantial resources to producing drinks rather than using those resources for other purposes. This prioritization reflects both the practical necessity of alcohol as a safer alternative to water and its cultural importance as a central element of social life. The international dimensions of medieval alcohol trade created connections between regions and cultures. Wine from Bordeaux reached England, creating economic and political ties that lasted for centuries. German beer influenced brewing practices in neighboring regions. Italian merchants spread winemaking knowledge as they traveled. The Hanseatic League traded beer across the Baltic and North Sea regions. These trade networks for alcohol were part of the broader medieval economy that connected different parts of Europe through commerce. The alcohol trade provided income for producers, employment for transporters and merchants, and tax revenue for governments along the trade routes. It also created cultural exchange, as people encountered drinks from other regions and sometimes adopted new tastes or techniques. The international alcohol trade was one strand in the web of connections that made medieval Europe an interconnected world despite the difficulties of travel and communication. Understanding this helps us see the medieval period not as isolated local communities, but as a complex system of relationships and exchanges that spanned considerable distances. The same forces driving globalization today, the search for profitable goods to trade, the spread of tastes and preferences, the movement of people and knowledge, were operating in medieval times, just on smaller scales and moving more slowly. In conclusion, getting wasted in medieval times was simultaneously more mundane and more dangerous than modern drinking. It was mundane because it happened constantly to almost everyone from early childhood onward, making intoxication a normal part of daily life rather than something special or transgressive. It was dangerous because the context, contaminated water, poor hygiene, limited medical knowledge, rough social conditions, and constant exposure to violence meant that the consequences of impaired judgment were often severe. Medieval people navigated this reality with remarkable success, building societies that functioned despite, or perhaps partially because of, constant mild intoxication. They created rich drinking cultures with elaborate rituals, produced vast quantities of alcoholic beverages using sophisticated techniques, and left behind a legacy that still influences how we think about and consume alcohol today. Their experiences remind us that human behaviors we might think are modern or unchanging actually vary enormously across time and place, shaped by technology, economics, religion, and social structure. Understanding medieval drinking isn't about judging it as better or worse than modern practices, but about appreciating it as a window into a different way of living, different values, and different challenges. The medieval drinker getting thoroughly wasted in a smoky tavern, the noble sipping fine wine in a great hall, the monk carefully brewing ale in a monastery, and the brewster producing her family's income one batch at a time, all were part of a complex system that sustained medieval civilization. Their stories, preserved in fragments in court records, chronicles, and archaeological evidence, let us glimpse lives very different from our own, yet recognizably human in their desires, their struggles, and their capacity for both wisdom and foolishness. As we've traveled through this long exploration of what getting wasted was like in medieval times and more, we've seen a society that was simultaneously strange and familiar, where alcohol united people across class and geography, while also revealing the divisions and tensions within medieval culture. The medieval experience with alcohol reflects broader themes of human existence: our need to cope with difficult circumstances, our desire for pleasure and community, our tendency to create elaborate cultural practices around basic activities, and our capacity to both build impressive civilizations and make terrible mistakes. The thousands of years of human relationship with alcohol, of which the medieval period is just one chapter, show patterns that transcend any particular time or place. We seek altered consciousness, we create rituals around drinking, we struggle with the tension between pleasure and harm, we try to regulate behavior while respecting freedom. These patterns will likely continue into the future, even as specific practices change. Understanding the medieval chapter of this long story enriches our understanding of both the past and ourselves. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.